Hey guys, tonight we're not looking at kings or knights or even battles. Instead, we're going to step quietly into the life of someone history barely noticed at all, a medieval stable boy, a figure so ordinary that his name was never written down, his face never carved, and yet his work carried on every single day, without pause, without glory. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps more people find these quiet little corners of history, and it lets me keep making them for you. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see the spread of night owls, early risers, and everyone in between. Now, dim the lights, maybe let the hum of a fan fill the background, and ease into the rhythm of tonight's story. You might almost hear the shuffle of straw underfoot, or the low breath of a horse waiting in the dark. Let's begin. The first light of dawn did not arrive suddenly in the medieval countryside. It stretched itself slowly across the horizon, a pale grey curtain that softened the edges of the fields, the hedgerows, and the clustered wooden buildings of the manor. There were no clocks to announce the hour, no bells yet rung from the village church. Time was measured instead by the colour of the sky, the shifting of birds from their nighttime roosts, and the faint stirring of animals whose lives were as deeply tied to the cycles of sun and season as the people who cared for them. The manor itself was not a castle of stone, though such places existed in richer lands. Here, it was a modest wooden hall, surrounded by outbuildings that supported the daily labour of its inhabitants. Smoke from banked hearths rose only faintly in the cool air, for the fires were not yet stoked again to life. To the east, the low mists rolled gently over the meadows, heavy with dew, clinging to the thatched roofs of cottages. The air smelled of damp earth and straw, of soil still holding the memory of yesterday's labour, and of the faint sweetness of hay stored through the summer months. Beyond the hall stretched fields divided into strips, each belonging to peasants bound by duty to the lord of the manor. These plots bore the scars of constant work, furrows where oxen had pulled wooden ploughs, ridges of soil turned over by calloused hands. The village beyond remained still, but within the manor's demes, the day had already begun to shape itself. For the animals did not wait upon the rhythms of human convenience, and the stable, dark, wooden, and smelling of horseflesh, was already demanding attention. It was here, within this quiet but essential corner of the manor grounds, that the stable boy stirred. His sleeping place was not far from the animals themselves, for warmth and proximity mattered more than comfort. He woke not because of alarm, but because the horses shifted, hooves clattered faintly on the wooden boards, and the instinctual routine of work pulled him upward even before his eyes were fully open. His body had grown accustomed to the rhythm of dawn, his muscles trained by necessity to rise with the first hint of light. The stable itself was little more than a long wooden structure, its timbers rough-hewn, its thatched roof patched in places by straw stuffed between gaps. The air within was heavy with the layered smells of hay, leather, damp wood, and the pungent odour of manure. Yet to him it was a familiar scent, not unpleasant, for it spoke of life, of warmth, of the creatures that defined his duties. Outside, the manor grounds shifted gradually into motion. In the distance, the faint call of a crow broke the silence, echoed soon after by the lowing of cattle waiting to be led to pasture. The first peasants stumbled from their cottages, still wrapped in wool, their breath clouding in the chill. They carried with them baskets, tools, or nothing at all, heading toward tasks repeated. So often they scarcely needed thought. The lord himself remained within the hall, asleep or rising more leisurely, for his duties were of a different kind. Supervision, authority, the management of labour owed to him. But at this hour, the manor did not belong to the lord, it belonged to the animals and those who cared for them. The stable boy, though low in the hierarchy, was already awake, already moving through the first shadows of the day. His role was small, almost invisible, but the horses upon which knights and lords depended could not function without his silent service. The countryside itself seemed to breathe with him. The hedges along the field edges rustled faintly as small birds flitted through them in search of seeds. The narrow dirt paths trodden daily by feet and hooves were damp with dew, leaving traces of water on boots and skirts. Beyond the manor fields, the forest loomed, a place of both resources and dangers, where wood was gathered, game hunted, and rumors of wolves lingered in hushed warnings. The light grew gradually stronger, stretching golden fingers across the edges of the wooden beams of the stable. Dust motes stirred in the air, caught in the glow. The boy pulled himself fully awake now, rubbing his eyes, stretching limbs stiff from straw bedding, listening to the rhythmic sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. Each animal was a presence, large and powerful, yet bound to him by a quiet routine that required patience, care, and an unending acceptance of repetition. Within the larger frame of medieval life, his awakening went unnoticed. No chronicler recorded the exact moment he rose. No noble considered his work, yet his presence was necessary. The plough horses would pull in the fields, the destriers would carry armoured riders, the palfreys would transport noble women or clergy, all of them dependent upon the invisible labour of the one who rose before dawn, ensuring their strength was fed, their coats brushed, their hooves tended. The manor grounds by this hour had shifted from silence to subdued motion. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys as fires were lit. The faint ring of a hammer sounded from the blacksmith's forge, as even he stirred earlier than most. But the dominant sound, to the boy's ears, was that of horses. Their breath, steaming in the cool air, mingled with the rustle of straw and the occasional thud of hooves. To others, these were background noises. To him they were a language, a rhythm that guided his own body, as surely as a monk's bells guided the hours of prayer. The dawn for the stable boy was never an event but a transition. It was a passage from stillness to movement, from darkness to labour. And as the sky shifted fully from grey to pale gold, the stable became the centre of his world, an unnoticed world, yet one that anchored the entire manor. The boy's day had begun. The first light of the day filtered slowly into the stable, not in bright shafts but in muted threads, creeping between the cracks in the timbered walls and softening against the dust that lingered in the air. The stable was never entirely dark. Even in the deepest night, faint embers from a lantern might glow, or the sheen of the moon might find its way through a chink in the thatch. But morning light carried a different weight. It gave form and contour to what had, only hours before, been indistinct shadows. The stable itself was a simple structure, long and narrow, built of oak beams cut roughly from the manor's own woods. The wood bore marks of the adze and axe, tool marks left unpolished, functional rather than decorative. Time had seasoned the timber to a grey-brown, rough to the touch, softened in places by damp air and the press of years. The roof above was thatched, thick with straw, layered and patched as necessary when birds or storms tore into it. It carried the faint smell of decay, but also the earth-rich odour of dried reeds, so familiar it passed without notice. Inside, the air was heavy, dense with scents that had accumulated over countless days and nights. The sharpness of manure was the most obvious, but it did not stand alone. It mingled with the sweetness of hay stacked in lofts above, the dry dust of straw scattered thickly underfoot, and the musky warmth of horseflesh. Leather contributed its own presence, from saddles and bridles hanging neatly, or not so neatly, along the walls. Iron buckles and nails added a faint tang of rust, subtle but present to anyone who lingered long enough to sense it. To the stable boy, these smells were not unpleasant. They were the natural fragrance of his world, layered and unchanging, as much a part of his existence as the taste of bread or the feel of wool against skin. Sound, too, shaped the stable. The building was never silent, though its noises were subdued, woven into the fabric of routine. Horses shifted in their stalls, hooves clopping softly against wooden boards. Some stamped once or twice, impatient, echoing low thuds across the beams. Breath came in steady, deep gusts, sometimes followed by the wet snort of air clearing nostrils, sending small clouds of dust spiraling. The rustle of straw marked the constant motion of animals adjusting themselves, lying down, rising again, pushing noses into feed troughs. Occasionally, teeth clattered softly against wood as a horse nibbled idly where it should not. All of it combined into a chorus of quiet life, rhythmic, repetitive, familiar. The stable boy, as he moved barefoot across the straw, felt these details with a sensitivity born not of luxury, but of necessity. He knew which creak of timber meant the roof sagged slightly in that corner. He recognized the difference between the hollow thump of a hoof against wood and the sharper ring of iron shoe on stone. He could tell, even half asleep, which horse shifted restlessly and which remained calm. These sounds did not demand interpretation. They offered it freely, as if the building itself spoke to those who lived long enough in its company. Textures surrounded him at every step. Straw prickled against skin, sharp at first touch, but softened with familiarity. The boards beneath his feet, though often buried beneath layers of bedding, pressed hard and uneven, worn smoother in places by decades of hooves and shovels. The wooden partitions between stalls were rough, splintered in places where horses had chewed at them or rubbed their flanks until the grain grew polished. The ropes that tied animals to posts were coarse, twisted fibers frayed at the ends, leaving traces on hands that pulled against them. Even the air itself had texture, thick with dust, moist with the condensation of breath, and damp earth, cool near the ground, warmer near the roof where air collected. The structure was plain yet functional. Stalls were arranged in a long row, each separated by low wooden walls. The floor sloped slightly, designed not out of comfort but of necessity, so that waste could drain and be shoveled away more easily. A loft overhead stored hay, accessible by ladder, its weight pressing down faintly on the beams. Hooks and pegs lined the walls, each holding tack, harness or simple tools. A trough ran along one side, filled with water drawn from the manor well, the surface reflecting dim light in ripples disturbed by horse muzzles. The stable boy's day always began here, in this interplay of smell, sound and texture. He moved first to check each stall, eyes still adjusting, hands moving over wooden gates worn smooth by use. He looked not for anything unusual, rarely did surprises occur, but simply to confirm that the rhythm remained intact. A horse lying too still, a water bucket tipped over, a rope come loose. These were small deviations, but in his world they mattered. The stable was not his home by choice, but by necessity, yet in its predictability, it offered a strange form of security. The building itself, like all structures of the medieval manor, existed not as a monument but as a tool. It had been raised by local labourers, repaired when necessary with whatever wood or reed was at hand. It was neither permanent nor fragile, a place designed to serve until time, fire, or neglect required it to be built again. And yet, in its ordinariness, it carried an atmosphere that those who worked within could not escape. It was not grandeur that defined the medieval world, but persistence of structures, of tasks, of lives bound to cycles that repeated endlessly. At first light, the stable reflected this persistence in its every detail. The dust rising in shafts of morning glow was the same dust that had risen the day before, and would rise again tomorrow. The creak of beams was the same creak heard for years, softened only by familiarity. Even the horses, restless yet tethered, mirrored their predecessors. For animals too came and went while the structure remained. To the stable boy, this sameness dulled the edge of hardship. Repetition bred endurance. The building, with all its textures and odors, reminded him each morning not of change but of continuity. Outside, the world of the manor continued to wake, but within the stable, time seemed slower, thicker, drawn out by the measured pace of animals stretching, the boy's own movements cautious and deliberate. The light taking its time to spread. Here, at first light, was the foundation of his day, and in many ways of his entire life. In the layered structure of medieval society, every person's position was marked by a quiet inevitability. The world was not imagined as fluid, where one might rise or fall by ambition, but as ordered, fixed and divinely sanctioned. To the people of the time, hierarchy was not simply a human invention, but a reflection of how the universe itself had been arranged. At the highest sat kings and popes, each claiming authority drawn from heaven. Beneath them, nobles, lords and bishops held power over land and people alike. Further down stretched the long and unending base of the pyramid, where peasants, serfs and servants lived their entire lives tethered to soil, duty, and labor. The stable boy belonged firmly to that base, unnoticed yet necessary. His role was neither glamorous nor recorded, but without him the machinery of feudal life would falter in small but meaningful ways. Horses were not luxuries, they were central to survival and control. They pulled the heavy plows that turned the soil, carried goods between manor and market, bore messengers with orders, and for lords and knights, served as the foundation of military power. And yet these animals required constant care, feeding, cleaning, grooming, tending to their hooves and tack. Such care was not performed by nobles, or even by free peasants, but by the unseen hands of boys like him, bound to a routine that gave him no recognition, yet bound him tightly to the manor's survival. The feudal system itself was a web of obligation. Land defined wealth, and nearly all land belonged to a lord who owed allegiance to someone above him. In return for protection and the right to cultivate strips of field, peasants worked not only for themselves, but also for their lord's demesne, the land reserved directly for his profit. The labor was unpaid, owed by custom and duty, stretching back generations. Serfs tied to the land could not leave without permission. Even those who were technically free peasants lived under constraints so heavy they rarely felt their independence. Servants such as the stable boy fell into a slightly different category. He did not own or till a strip of land. His existence was one of service, a life shaped by tasks assigned to him within the manor's household economy. He was not a craftsman, nor a freeman with rights to trade. He was not ordained like the village priest, nor cloistered like the monks whose manuscripts would record the deeds of lords. Instead, he inhabited a quieter space, one of perpetual labor that produced no surplus for himself, only continuity for others. In the rigid imagination of medieval society, each of these roles was considered part of a divine order. The idea of the three estates circulated widely: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. The boy, of course, belonged to the last estate, the workers whose labor supported both prayer and battle. His hands did not touch parchment or sword, but straw, rope, and hoof. And yet, in their humble way, such hands kept knights mounted, plows turning, and carts moving. Still, his place remained unseen. Chronicles of the age listed kings and bishops, battles and treaties, the building of cathedrals and the fall of dynasties. Rarely did they mention the servant who rose before dawn to shovel straw and carry water. His presence is known only indirectly, inferred from the necessities of animals that could not care for themselves. A horse in shining barding, carrying a knight into war, required years of unseen labor to reach that moment of spectacle. Behind every destrier in battle stood not only the knight, but the nameless servant who brushed its coat in the cold, fed it in the dark, and cleaned its stall long after others slept. The stable boy's anonymity was not unusual. Most lives of his kind passed into silence, unrecorded and unmourned beyond family or village. In death, his body would be laid in the churchyard, beneath a marker of wood that decayed in a few seasons. No stone would carry his name forward. His memory would dissolve, absorbed back into the endless cycle of peasant existence. This was the rhythm of the feudal world: individuals forgotten, roles remembered. To modern eyes, his position might appear suffocating, defined by a lack of opportunity, by hardship, and by the certainty of anonymity. But within the logic of his age, it was a place as natural as the sunrise. People believed they were born into the stations appointed to them by God. Lords ruled because they were meant to. Peasants labored because such was their lot, and servants bent their backs to work because no other path existed. The boy likely thought little of it. His world did not encourage questions of status or destiny. Instead, it taught obedience, patience, and the acceptance of cycles that repeated without change. And yet, his role, small though it was, linked him indirectly to wider currents of medieval life. Horses connected villages to towns, fields to markets, lords to knights. Every strap tightened on a saddle, every bucket carried to a trough, every hoof cleaned with a worn tool contributed, in its way, to the functioning of a system far larger than himself. He He was part of the invisible scaffolding of feudalism, the labor beneath the grandeur, the silence beneath the clang of swords. In this way, the boy's life was both marginal and essential. He stood on the lowest rung of the ladder, his name destined never to be known, his tasks repetitive and unnoticed. Yet, without him the manor's routines would falter, the lord's horses would weaken, and the intricate balance of duty and obligation would begin to strain. His obscurity was the price of the system's stability. Thus, the boy lived not as an individual of note, but as a fragment of a structure larger than himself. His place was humble, his work relentless, his recognition non-existent, but his presence, like the beams of the stable, held weight even if no one looked upon it. This was his world, the feudal order, vast and rigid, with him at the bottom, carrying quietly the burdens that history never thought to record. The rhythm of the stable day began not with shouting or hurry, but with the quiet, deliberate labor of feeding. Horses, large and powerful though they were, depended entirely on the boy's small hands, and the first light of dawn marked the beginning of his daily duty to them. There was no variation, no surprise in this ritual. The order of tasks repeated so faithfully that time itself seemed measured by the weight of a bucket, the scrape of hay, the creak of wood against rope. He began with grain, stored in sacks stacked along the stable's wall. The grain was coarse and dusty, harvested from the manor's fields the autumn before. Barley was the most common, though oats were also prized for horses, less suited for bread, but useful for strength and endurance. The boy untied the rough cord of a sack and reached in with a wooden scoop. The grain shifted like dry sand, releasing a faint earthy smell, heavier than flour, but lighter than soil. He measured by habit, not by scale or rule, for experience had taught him what portion filled a stomach without waste. The scoop clattered softly against the trough as he emptied it, then returned again, repeating until each horse's feed had been portioned. The sound of grain striking wood stirred the animals to motion. Heads lifted, ears flicked forward, hooves shifted with soft impatience. A few let out low whickers, deep and rhythmic, as if acknowledging the approach of food. Their bodies, outlined faintly by the pale light filtering into the stable, leaned forward against the wooden partitions, waiting. To anyone unaccustomed, these motions might seem restless or demanding, but to the boy they were expected, part of the familiar pattern. Once the grain had been delivered, he turned to hay. Above, the loft stored bales gathered and dried during the summer, stacked tightly to last the long winter months, when pasture lay dormant. A ladder rose to the loft, its rungs polished by hands and feet over many seasons. He climbed it carefully, feeling the rough wood beneath his fingers, his body moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done so many times before. In the loft, the air was drier, filled with the sweet, dusty scent of hay. The bundles were rough, but manageable, bound with twine that cut faint lines into his palms. He dragged down enough for the morning meal, the stalks rustling and breaking as they slid down into the stable below. Carrying armfuls to each stall, he spread the hay slowly, letting it fall in uneven piles. The horses lowered their heads immediately, pulling strands with steady bites, jaws working in a rhythm that became another part of the stable's chorus. Their chewing was patient, constant, the sound muffled by the thick air. Some hay scattered underfoot, trampled into the straw that already lined the ground. It was waste in one sense, but inevitable. The cycle of feeding always included loss. Water was the most laborious part. Buckets had to be filled from the well near the manor yard. A short walk but a heavy burden. The boy lifted a wooden pail, the handle pressing into the calloused groove of his hand, and carried it outside. The morning air was still cool, carrying the smell of damp earth and faint wood smoke from cottages. At the well he dropped the bucket down with a splash, rope scraping against stone as he hauled it up again. The water, drawn fresh and cold, sloshed heavily with each step back toward the stable. He poured it into troughs, the surface rippling with soft rings before returning again to fetch more. The repetition was tiring but unchanging, and he moved without thought, guided by habit more than will. One by one, each stall was supplied, grain in troughs, hay on the ground, water in buckets. Each horse lowered its head in turn, breath steaming faintly as it bent to feed. Their satisfaction was not loud or expressive, but visible in the slow rhythm of eating, the steady movement of strong jaws, the calm swish of tails. A visitor might have seen nothing remarkable in the scene, yet to the boy, these moments of stillness after feeding carried a subtle reassurance. The animals were cared for, their hunger met, the day set upon its proper course. The act of feeding was not merely duty, but grounding. In the endless hierarchy of medieval life, where his place was low and his recognition non-existent, this task gave him a rhythm that was both humbling and stabilizing. It was work that would never end. Horses would always hunger again. Water would always be needed again. Hay would always diminish. But its endlessness gave it meaning. Like the tolling of church bells that divided the hours of the day for monks, the routine of feeding divided his time into cycles that repeated, anchoring him against the drift of seasons. There was also a quiet intimacy to the task. Each horse, though large and sometimes indifferent, revealed personality in its feeding. One stamped its hoof impatiently until the trough was filled. Another ate slowly, pulling mouthfuls with care. A third snorted loudly, scattering dust, before plunging its muzzle deep into the hay. The boy knew these habits as well as he knew the creaks of the stable's beams. His care was not affectionate in the way of companionship, for animals were not pets. It was practical, shaped by necessity. Yet in the long hours spent side by side, a silent bond formed, wordless but steady. The stable at this hour was filled not with voices, but with the sounds of feeding, the shuffle of hooves, the slow rhythm of chewing, the occasional clatter of a bucket, or the faint splash of water. Light grew gradually stronger, revealing the textures of straw underfoot, the sheen of horse coats, the dull shine of iron nails in wood. Dust floated in the air, caught in the glow, settling only to rise again with the next movement. By the time the last bucket was poured, and the last armful of hay scattered, the stable was transformed. The restless energy of dawn had settled into calm. Horses stood content, their bodies still save for the slow motion of jaws. The boy paused, leaning briefly against a wooden post, breathing in the mingled scents of hay, grain and animal warmth. The work was not yet finished. There would be stalls to clean, tools to prepare, endless small tasks to complete. But for a moment, in the steady rhythm of animals feeding, there was a sense of quiet completion. This was how his day always began, not with words, not with ceremony, but with the repetitive, grounding labor of feeding the manor's horses. It was a task invisible to history, yet vital to the life of the manor, repeated endlessly, shaping both his days and his sense of time itself. After the first hunger of the horses was satisfied, the stable settled into a kind of heavy silence. The air no longer held the sound of impatient hooves or low nickers, only the steady rhythm of chewing. It was in this quiet that the next stage of work began, the slow, repetitive task of cleaning the stalls. The boy did not rush. There was no need. Cleaning was a duty that demanded patience rather than speed, for every corner had to be reached, every patch renewed. He fetched the wooden rake and the short-handled shovel, tools worn smooth by years of hands much like his own. Their edges were chipped, their weight uneven, but they fit naturally against his palms, as though shaped to his grip. The process always began the same way. He stepped into the first stall, feeling the ground uneven beneath his feet, where the straw had been trampled through the night. The smell was sharp, an earthy mix of damp hay, animal warmth, and the acrid tang of waste. It was not a stench to him though, it was the smell of work, of necessity, as familiar as the air itself. Others might turn away, but for him it was simply another texture of life, one that carried no surprise. With the shovel, he scraped and lifted the soiled straw, tossing it into a pile near the doorway. Each movement was steady, almost meditative. Scrape, lift, toss, and return. The straw gave way easily, brittle stalks breaking apart as they were shifted. Beneath the upper layer lay dampness, darker and heavier, clinging together in clumps that released their odor when disturbed. The boy did not flinch. He simply worked through it, as he had done every morning before. When one stall was cleared, he raked across the floorboards, smoothing the surface into rough lines. Dust rose in faint clouds, drifting upward in shafts of pale light that filtered through cracks in the wooden walls. The air thickened for a moment, then cleared again, settling into silence. Horses nearby shifted slightly, acknowledging the movement with the flick of a tail or a soft snort, but none protested. They had grown used to his presence, as much a part of their routine as the feeding itself. He carried the waste outside, bucket by bucket, to the dung heap at the edge of the manor grounds. There, in a rising mound of earth and straw, the remnants of countless mornings collected. To others it might have seemed unpleasant, a symbol of drudgery, but within the rhythm of manorial life it had its place. The waste would rot, turning into manure, which would then feed the fields, which in turn would grow the grain, which would again be harvested and fed to the animals. Nothing was ever wasted. Even refuse found its purpose in the endless cycle of use and renewal. The boy, though young, understood this without needing to be taught. It was simply the way things were. Returning, he carried fresh straw into the stalls. It was rough on his arms, the stalks scratching faint lines across his skin, the dust catching in his throat, but he spread it evenly across the floor. The clean layer brightened the stall, its pale gold strands a stark contrast to the darkness that had been removed. He spread it with care, not hurriedly, but with deliberate motions, ensuring that the horses would have comfort beneath their hooves, that dampness would not linger too long, that the cycle of cleanliness and dirt would begin anew. This process repeated from stall to stall, each one a small world unto itself, each one requiring the same patience. The boy's movements grew mechanical, his body working almost apart from his thoughts. The scrape of shovel, the rustle of straw, the clatter of a bucket set down upon wood, all these sounds blended into a rhythm as steady as a chant. There was no rush, no expectation of completion beyond the inevitable end. Yet within this repetition lay a subtle contrast, the stillness of the animals and the labor of the boy. The horses, having eaten, stood calm, their muscles shifting occasionally, but otherwise at rest. They were silent presences, great bodies at ease. The boy moved among them, his small form bent to the tasks of cleaning, his breath slow but deliberate. The difference between the quiet strength of the animals and the quiet persistence of his work was marked, but together they formed the stable's balance, rest and effort, stillness and labor. When he paused, leaning on his rake for a brief moment, he noticed the way light now spilled more freely into the stable. Dawn had fully broken, its brightness filtering through cracks in the roof and walls, catching in the dust that still drifted gently through the air. The smell of fresh straw mingled with the lingering heaviness of waste, creating a layered scent that spoke of both labor completed and labor ongoing. To anyone else, it might have seemed unpleasant or unremarkable, but to him it was simply life as it always was. The work left his body tired, though never in a way that surprised him. His arms bore the ache of lifting, his back bent with strain, his hands rubbed raw against rough wood and straw, but fatigue was as much a part of his world as breathing, so familiar it hardly seemed to matter. Labor and stillness existed together, his movements against the unmoving patience of the animals, his effort against their rest, his weariness against their quiet satisfaction. By the time the last stall was completed, the stable bore little resemblance to the place it had been at dawn. What had been damp and heavy was now fresh and ordered. The ground was lined with straw, pale and new. Buckets rested neatly, tools leaned against their posts, and the boy himself stood for a moment in silence, breathing deeply in the still air. He knew it would not last. By the next dawn, the work would need to be done again. The stalls would again be soiled. The cycle repeated. Yet there was a sense of rightness in that inevitability. Stability did not come from permanence, but from repetition. For the stable boy, the act of cleaning was not glamorous, nor did it carry prestige, but it carried meaning in its endlessness. It was work that vanished the moment it was completed, only to be required again, but that vanishing gave it rhythm, much like the rise and fall of days themselves. And so, the stable stood ready for the hours ahead. its horses fed, its stalls renewed, its silence filled with the faintest echoes of labor now completed. Within the dim, timber-framed structure of the stable, tucked between the rough-hewn beams, and leaning against walls darkened by years of dust and touch, lay the tools of the stable boy's life. They were not many, nor were they remarkable. They bore no ornament, no craft designed to impress the eye. They were practical, plain, and aged. And yet, in their wear and their quiet persistence, they told the story of a world where work left its deepest marks, not on parchment, but on wood, metal, and rope. The brushes came first to hand. Made of coarse bristles bound tightly to wooden backs, they carried the faint shine of oil where countless palms had smoothed their edges. Their bristles, once stiff and sharp, had grown uneven and softened with time, bent by the resistance of horsehair and dulled by years of labor. To touch one was to feel both the persistence of daily care and the erosion of time, fibers worn down, not in sudden bursts of effort, but in slow attrition, morning after morning. Each stroke against a horse's flank left no trace upon the world, yet accumulated into the shape of the brush itself, a silent witness to grooming that kept the animals healthy, their coats shining under rare glimpses of sun. The buckets, stout and wooden, carried water and grain with equal constancy. The iron bands that circled them were rusted in places, rough with age, but still secure. Their bases bore scars from rough ground, their handles grooves from endless lifting. The boy had carried them so often that the feel of their weight was part of his body's rhythm, as natural as his own steps. When filled, they sloshed and creaked, water darkening the wood, grain settling in shifting heaps. When emptied, they thudded softly upon the straw. They were tools of passage, not permanence, holding nothing for long, but always ready to serve again. Leaning against the wall stood the pitchfork, tall and narrow, its tines forged roughly by the manor's smith. The metal was not sharp in the manner of a blade, but strong enough to pierce and lift hay or manure. The handle, long and worn, had grown smooth where hands had grasped it, leaving faint depressions in the grain of the wood. Each groove marked the repetition of countless lifts and tosses, arcs of labor that disappeared into the air and left only tired muscles and altered straw behind. Its shape was simple, unchanged for generations, for no innovation was needed. Its purpose was constant, its design eternal in its simplicity. Ropes hung in coils, rough-hewn and fraying at the edges, their fibers stiffened with sweat, mud and rain. They smelled faintly of hemp, earthy and raw, and bore discoloration from years of use. Some had been spliced, knotted where breaks had come, their imperfections reminders of repair rather than replacement. They tethered horses, bound bundles of hay, secured buckets during transport, and occasionally served for tasks outside the stable. They were not valued for beauty, but for their strength, and though they aged, they rarely gave way without notice. In their twisted strands lay the memory of strain, of pressure, of tension eased and renewed countless times. Smaller tools rested alongside these rakes for smoothing straw, shovels for clearing refuse, knives for cutting twine. Each bore the quiet marks of age, handles darkened with oils from touch, blades dulled and sharpened, until their shapes shifted slightly from the original, edges no longer even but jagged with history. None were prized possessions. They were communal, passed from one hand to another, from one season into the next. Yet, each hand left something behind in them, a memory that no one spoke but which lingered in the wear itself. In the low light of the stable, these objects formed a collection that few would admire, yet without which no horse could be kept, no field ploughed, no cart pulled. Their plainness was their meaning. They were not crafted for display but for use, and through use they endured. The boy knew them not as objects to be considered, but as extensions of his own body. He did not think of the brush as separate from the act of grooming, nor the shovel as apart from the act of clearing. They were simply the shapes his hands took in labor. The stable itself seemed to absorb the presence of these tools, holding them in shadow when not in use, waiting in silence until called upon again. Their stillness contrasted with the boy's movement, but together they completed the cycle of work, tools waiting, boy working, animals receiving. When one wore out beyond repair, another was made, simple and functional, continuing the same pattern without ceremony. Yet, even discarded tools lingered at the edges of the manor yard, broken handles or bent tines left to weather into the earth, silent remnants of lives of use. If the manor's hall was marked by tapestries and carved wood, by objects meant to signify wealth and memory, the stable was marked by these humbler implements. They did not proclaim anything, did not tell stories in color or stone, but their very ordinariness revealed another kind of permanence, the persistence of unnoticed work. For centuries, tools like these had served in stables across the countryside, in manors and villages alike, shaping the rhythm of days for boys whose names were never recorded. To look upon them was to see the layers of time pressed, not into parchment, but into wood and iron, into bristles and rope. The boy did not reflect on this. He simply reached for what was needed, his hands finding the familiar weight, his body falling into the practiced movements of labor. Yet the tools themselves bore the memory of his life, each scrape and strain etched invisibly into their forms. They were the silent companions of his world, unnoticed by others, but indispensable to him. And so in the stable at morning's edge, where light crept in through narrow gaps and dust drifted like motes of memory, the tools of the stable boy lay waiting, not polished, not adorned, but worn with years of unnoticed work. To understand the stable was to understand not just the boy's labor or the tools of his hand, but the horses themselves, the living center of his world. Their presence shaped every task, every routine, every breath of the stable's air. They were not merely beasts of burden, they were the engines of manorial life, their bodies carrying the weight of plows, carts, riders and soldiers alike. And in their varied forms, coats and tempers, they reflected both the quiet rhythm of the fields and the latent violence of war. The manor kept several types of horses, for no single breed could serve every purpose. At the heart of the stable stood the great destriers, though fewer in number. These were the largest, bred for the battlefield, their bodies thick with muscle, their necks arched proudly even in rest. Their coats glistened when brushed, whether chestnut, black or dappled grey, their manes coarse and heavy. To look upon them was to see power at rest, a coiled strength that could, at the command of a mounted knight, surge forward into the clash of war. Yet for the boy they were not symbols of chivalry, but simply another mouth to feed, another stall to clean. Their size made his work heavier, their appetite greater, but in his small hands their grandeur was diminished to routine. More common were the rounceys. These were the general-purpose horses, used for riding and travel by squires, retainers and messengers. Leaner than destriers, less heavily muscled, they carried a balance of strength and endurance. Their temperaments varied. Some were restless, quick to shift or stamp, others patient, content to wait through the quiet hours. Their coats were often bay or brown, less striking than the destrier's sheen, but durable, practical, much like the lives they served. The boy grew most familiar with these, for they formed the majority of his daily care, their needs shaping the ordinary rhythm of the stable. Then there were the palfreys, smaller and smoother in gait, prized for comfort in riding rather than force. These were often favored by women of the manor, or by lords who valued ease in travel. Their coats tended toward lighter shades, palomino or cream, though variety existed in every stable. Their movements were graceful, their tempers mild, and though the boy treated them no differently than the others, he could not help but notice the way their presence softened the stable, their eyes calm, their bodies gentle. In the shadows of these more notable breeds stood the humble workhorses, the draft animals that drew plows through the manor fields and hauled carts laden with grain, firewood or stone. Heavy-bodied, broad-shouldered, their coats often dull with dirt and dust. They lacked the elegance of destriers or palfreys, yet they were indispensable. Without their strength, fields would not be tilled, harvests not gathered, supplies not moved. The boy's work was heaviest with these, for their bulk required more feed, more water, more straw. Their temperaments were steady, often patient, though their sheer size made care laborious. To him they were less noble than the war horses, less graceful than the palfreys, but in truth, they carried the manor's survival on their broad backs. Each horse carried within it a temperament shaped by breed and by individual spirit. Some were gentle, nuzzling the boy's shoulder when he entered the stall, their breath warm against his skin. Others were aloof, turning away as if indifferent to his presence. A few were stubborn, stamping hooves or pulling against the rope when led outside. He learned to read them not through words, but through posture, ears flicking back or forward, tails swishing, nostrils flaring. Their moods were quiet but legible, and his work depended upon recognizing these signs, adjusting his movements with patience rather than force. The coats of the horses told another story. They varied in color, deep bays, shining blacks, soft grays, and the occasional striking white. In winter, their hair thickened, duller and rough to the touch, while in summer it smoothed and gleamed when brushed. Dust clung to them easily, dulling their natural sheen, and so grooming was both necessity and ritual, restoring what labor and weather had diminished. The boy's brushes carried away dirt and sweat, leaving behind a faint glow under the dim light, a small transformation repeated day after day. Beyond the stable, their roles shaped the manor's life. In the fields, plough horses dragged the heavy iron ploughs that cut through soil, their muscles straining, their breath steaming in the cold. Without them, human hands and oxen alone could not have sustained the manor's agriculture. On the roads, rounceys and palfreys carried riders between villages, towns and markets, binding the manor to the wider world. In war, destriers bore armored knights into combat, their weight and strength magnifying the violence of battle. Though the boy never saw the clash of knights himself, he knew that the great horse in the far stall was meant for that purpose. Its size no accident, its care no luxury but preparation. Yet within the stable, all roles blurred into sameness. War horse and plough horse alike required feeding, watering, grooming, and cleaning. Their differences mattered less to the boy than the constancy of their needs. For him they were not symbols or categories, but presences, large, breathing, restless presences that filled the air with their warmth and their smells, shaping the silence of his world. The horses gave the stable its atmosphere. Their bodies radiated heat, softening the chill of dawn. Their movements filled the quiet with sound, the shuffle of hooves on straw, the swish of tails, the steady chewing of hay. Their smell, a mingling of sweat, earth, hay, and leather, became the scent of the boy's life, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his skin. To others, it might have seemed unpleasant, but to him, it was the smell of home, of labor, of routine. There were moments, in pauses between tasks, when he simply observed them, the rise and fall of their flanks as they breathed, the faint twitch of ears responding to sounds too distant for his own ears to catch, the gentle shifting of weight from one leg to another. In these moments, the boy's smallness was most apparent, his body dwarfed by their mass, his presence insignificant beside theirs. Yet he did not fear them. He had grown among them, and their size was simply another fact of life, as ordinary as the beams of the stable itself. The manor horses were not companions in the way of pets, nor were they abstract symbols of wealth or power, as they might appear in chronicles or in the eyes of a lord. They were working creatures, bound to cycles of labor as much as the boy himself. Their strength sustained the manor, their presence shaped its routines, and their needs dictated his own. In the quiet hours of morning, when stalls were clean and feeding complete, they stood as the stable's heart, different in breed, in coat, in purpose, yet united in their stillness, their silence, their waiting. And the boy, moving among them with tools worn smooth and hands calloused by repetition, belonged to them as much as they belonged to the manor. Obedience for the stable boy was not an idea spoken aloud or written in rules. It was a condition of life, absorbed quietly through repetition, until it became indistinguishable from breathing. From the moment he woke, his body bent toward the will of others. First the manor lord, whose unseen commands shaped the rhythm of his days, then the steward, who relayed tasks with authority, and finally the horses themselves, whose sheer size demanded deference. In a world ordered by hierarchy, he existed at its lowest rung, and his survival depended on knowing, without question, how to obey. The manor itself was a structure built of obedience. Fields were tilled because peasants obeyed the seasons, the steward's orders, and the obligations of feudal duty. The hall stood tall because masons and carpenters obeyed the craft, the command of their masters. and the expectations of those above them. Even the church bells that tolled through the valley marked obedience, to prayer, to God, to the cycle of hours that bound human life. The boy, though too young to understand such structures in abstract, absorbed them bodily. He felt them in the rhythm of work, and in the silence with which he accepted his tasks. His obedience to the Lord was distant, indirect. The nobleman rarely entered the stable. His presence was felt instead in the requirements that filtered downward. Horses had to be kept ready for travel, for display, for war. Saddles had to be prepared, hooves shod, coats gleaming when called for. The boy never heard the Lord's voice give him an order, yet everything he did was shaped by the nobleman's unseen will. His hands moved because another man's authority extended outward, binding even those whose names he would never learn. Closer was the steward or master of horses, whose eye passed over every detail. His authority was less abstract, more immediate, spoken in clipped instructions or a frown that lingered longer than comfort allowed. The boy learned quickly that silence was safer than reply, that obedience was not simply doing what was told, but doing so without hesitation, without question. Delay was a form of disobedience. Forgetfulness was inexcusable. The boy's hands had to move before his thoughts, his body anticipating the demand before it came. And then there were the animals. Horses obeyed no lord, no steward, no word of command, unless managed with patience and skill. Their obedience was conditional, requiring not only food and care but constant vigilance. A destriera's hooves could crush bones without malice. A draft horse's sudden movement could knock a boy to the ground. The boy learned to bow his body not only before human masters, but before the living presence of animals larger and stronger than himself. His obedience to them was not reverence, but survival. He moved quietly around them, always from the side rather than behind, never startling them with sudden touch. He learned to read the flick of an ear, the stamp of a hoof, the widening of eyes. These small signs became commands in their own right, directing him to step back, to wait, to approach slowly. A restless horse demanded stillness from him. A calm one allowed his hand to work more freely. The boy obeyed without words, adjusting his rhythm to theirs, submitting his smaller body to their larger presence. This constant submission shaped his spirit as much as his body. He became careful, restrained, his gestures small and deliberate. His voice, seldom raised, fell into the rhythm of whispers. If it sounded at all, he did not expect notice or praise. Obedience was its own end, an expectation without reward. The satisfaction he found lay in the completion of tasks, in the silent acknowledgement that nothing had gone wrong, no punishment invited, no anger stirred. The hierarchy was so deeply ingrained that he did not question it. To resist was unthinkable, not because he lacked imagination, but because the idea of refusal had no place in his world. Just as the sun rose and set, just as the seasons turned, obedience was constant. He accepted orders, as he accepted the changing of the weather, as something beyond his control, and beyond his right to alter. His thoughts, if he had them, remained inward, shaped into stillness by the weight of repetition. There was, too, a strange kinship between his obedience and that of the horses. They too were trained into patterns, responding to reins, to spurs, to the pull of harness. Their freedom was shaped into service, their strength directed toward tasks they did not choose. The boy in his own way mirrored them, guided by reins he could not see, bent by commands he did not question. Both boy and horse lived in submission, their lives defined by service, their labor invisible beyond its immediate use. Yet within this obedience lay a quiet strength. The boy's body learned endurance through submission, carrying the weight of tasks without complaint. His spirit, though bent, grew steady in its silence, shaped by the patience required to serve both man and beast. In his stillness, he held a kind of resilience, one that would never be celebrated in songs or stories, but one that sustained the hidden foundation of the manor's life. At the close of morning's labor, when the stalls were clean and the horses fed, the boy remained a figure of obedience, not proud, not recognized, but constant. His silence, his submission, his discipline, were invisible threads binding the stable together, unseen by those above but necessary to the rhythm of life below. By the time the sun had risen high enough to press its warmth onto the thatched roof of the stable, the long rhythm of morning work had already settled into the boy's limbs. The horses were fed, watered, and brushed. The stalls had been swept clean, new straw laid out in crisp layers beneath hooves that shifted only occasionally. Buckets had been filled and set in their places. The brushes, forks, and ropes were returned to the wall, their edges worn smooth by years of unnoticed use. The air that had once been thick with the smells of dung and churned straw now held something quieter, an earthy stillness, as though the stable itself had taken a breath and exhaled. Midday was a different kind of silence than dawn. At dawn, silence was fragile, poised to break with the sound of hooves, buckets, or the creak of wood. But noon silence was heavy, thickened by the weight of heat and the slowness of bodies. The boy felt it press down, not unpleasantly, but insistently, as if telling him to pause. His shoulders loosened, and he sank against the rough wooden beam that stood near the stable door. The straw beneath him yielded just enough to soften the hardness of the ground. Above him, shafts of light filtered through small gaps in the roof thatch, forming pale ladders of dust. Tiny particles drifted endlessly in their beams, suspended like a slow dance. The boy's eyes followed them without focus, his mind emptying in the way only labor and stillness together could bring. His breath slowed, his body becoming as much a fixture of the stable as the buckets and tools that surrounded him. The horses, too, fell into the rhythm of midday, their movements quieted, tails flicking lazily at flies that hummed near their coats. Occasionally a hoof shifted, or a jaw ground hay with slow insistence, but the sounds were muffled, absorbed into the larger silence. Even their breathing seemed slower, heavier, as though they too were aware of the sun's weight pressing on the roof above them. Outside the stable, the manor continued its life, though at a reduced pace. The sound of tools striking in the fields, scythes cutting, hoes turning, grew dull in the distance as labourers paused for food or shade. In the kitchen yard, the faint clang of pots and ladles echoed, the cooks preparing the Lord's meal with the same steady repetition that guided every corner of the estate. Somewhere further off, a dog barked once and then fell silent, retreating into the haze of the heat. The village road, visible in part through the stable doorway, lay nearly deserted, its dust rising faintly under the sun's glare. The boy, though young, did not rush to fill this stillness. He was not trained to seek distraction in moments of pause. Instead, he sat in it, allowing his body to rest, his eyes to wander without purpose, his thoughts barely formed. His rest was not idleness but necessity. Labor demanded it, and the day's length allowed it. In the space between morning work and afternoon tasks, there was little more to do than wait. The stable itself seemed to hold its breath. Wood creaked softly as beams expanded under the heat, the faint sound of shifting structure reminding him that even buildings moved in their own slow rhythm. The smell of warm straw deepened, heavy and comforting, blending with the faint scent of horse sweat that lingered even after brushing. Dust settled on the boy's tunic and hair, unnoticed, as the air remained thick and unmoving. For a moment, the boy could imagine that time itself had slowed, that the manor outside had stilled along with him, caught in the heavy pause of noon. This was not the kind of rest known to lords or knights, who measured their hours with tasks, councils, or journeys. Nor was it the leisure of monks, who structured their pauses with prayer. This was the rest of the unnoticed, simple, unmeasured, arising from the body's quiet demand to be still. Though he rested, obedience lingered. He knew that when the steward's shadow crossed the threshold, or when a horse stirred restlessly, his pause would end without question. Midday stillness was always temporary, borrowed time within the unending rhythm of work. But for now, he let the warmth soak into his skin, let his body sink deeper into the straw, and let the silence gather around him like a second skin. If anyone had looked into the stable at that moment, they might have seen nothing remarkable. A boy resting in shadow, horses standing in quiet patience, dust drifting in pale shafts of light. Yet in that ordinariness lay the essence of his life. Work balanced by pause, silence broken by rhythm, a body shaped by tasks, and by the brief reprieve between them. Outside, the sun continued its slow arc, indifferent to the boy's pause, indifferent to the manor's rhythm, indifferent to the horse's breathing. Time moved, even if it felt momentarily suspended. Soon enough, the stillness would yield again to labor. But for this short interval, midday belonged to silence, to warmth, to the unnoticed stillness of a stable and its boy. Smell was the first and last presence of the stable, the constant backdrop that marked every moment of the boy's life within it. If sight gave him beams of dust, movement of animals, and the flicker of sunlight across wood, smell was deeper, more encompassing, woven into every breath he took. It was not a detail he noted consciously. Rather, it became the ground of his existence, a presence so constant that he no longer thought of it as separate from himself. To step into the stable was to enter a world of odors, each one layered upon the other, mingling into an atmosphere that could not be escaped. The first note was always hay, dry, brittle, and sweet. Its dust rose at the slightest disturbance, the drag of a fork, the toss of a bundle, the shifting of a horse's muzzle as it pulled strands into its mouth. It carried a faint sharpness, a sweetness that clung to the boy's tunic and hair, so that even when he left the stable, people would know where he had been. Hay had a warmth to it, a smell of fields dried under the summer sun and cut down to sustain the animals through the winter. When fresh straw was laid in the stalls, it carried the same brightness, though tinged with the faint green of grass not long cut. That smell, sharper, fresher, always faded into the drier, heavier scent that clung to the old layers beneath. Alongside hay was the thick, damp odor of the wood that held the stable together. Beams, stalls, and doors all carried the smell of oak, darkened by age and moisture. Rain seeped through the roof thatch in places, leaving the scent of rot at the edges where water lingered too long. The boy knew the smell of wet timber, heavy and swollen, different from the clean dryness of sun-warmed wood. He knew, too, the sharpness of fresh shavings when repairs were made, a scent that carried the memory of forest, the green tang of cut bark and sap. Most days, though, the wood smelled simply of time, a background presence, neither fresh nor foul, a reminder of permanence against the shifting odors of hay and horse. The smell of leather was sharper, more distinct. Harnesses, bridles, and saddles all carried their own odors, shaped by tanning, by oil, by sweat. Well cared for leather had a dense, almost sweet richness, a smell that clung to the boy's hands when he rubbed oil into cracked straps. Poorly kept leather, neglected and dry, gave off a dusty sourness that spoke of neglect. Most of the stable's pieces lay somewhere in between, worn smooth from use, softened by years of handling, carrying the mingled scents of horse and man. Saddles in particular carried a deep, musky smell, soaked through with sweat, dust, and the oil meant to preserve them. For the boy, leather was not only a smell, but a marker of work. Each time he caught it in the air, he thought of polishing, repairing, or buckling straps. And then, always, there was manure. Its presence was inescapable, a constant layer beneath all others. Fresh dung carried a sharp, pungent tang that filled the nostrils, strong enough to catch at the throat. Older piles, dampened and spread, took on a heavier, almost earthy note, closer to soil than waste. The boy was accustomed to both. The smell no longer struck him as unpleasant. It was simply there, woven into the fabric of his labor. Each time he cleaned the stalls, the odor rose sharply, then faded again as straw was laid, and the balance shifted. To an outsider, it might have been overwhelming. To him, it was part of the air itself. Sweat, too, mingled into the atmosphere. Horses, even at rest, carried a thick, musky scent, heavy in the heat of summer, sharper after work. Their bodies exuded warmth, their hides damp in patches that dried slowly, leaving behind a salty tang that mixed with the dust of their coats. The boy's own sweat blended into this unnoticed chorus. His tunic, soaked and dried many times over, carried a smell of labor, salt, dust, and skin that never truly washed away. Together, the sweat of man and animal bound them in a single atmosphere, indistinguishable from one another within the enclosed space of the stable. Other scents came and went in smaller currents. The acrid bite of smoke drifted in on days when fires burned in the manor kitchens or in the fields. The faint sweetness of spilled grain lingered near the feed bins, attracting mice whose own musky odor was faint but noticeable when nests were disturbed. Occasionally, The metallic tang of blood cut through the stable air from a horse nicked during shoeing, or from a rat struck by the steward's stick. These sharper scents never lasted long but broke the monotony, leaving brief traces before fading back into the stable's larger harmony. All these layers, hay, wood, leather, manure, sweat, and dust, blended into one indistinguishable whole. The boy did not think of them as separate after his first weeks of work. To him, they were simply the stable's presence, a living odor that clung to his skin, his clothes, his very breath. When he left the stable, he carried it with him, marking him unmistakably as someone who worked among horses. Villagers in the manor's orbit would recognize it, though few remarked upon it. Smell was a silent identity, an unspoken sign of one's labor. A cook carried the sharpness of smoke and meat, a smith the heavy tang of iron and ash, and the stable boy the mixture of hay and manure. Each belonged to its place, each marked by odor as much as by task. Over time, the boy stopped noticing the stable's scent in the way one ceases to notice one's own shadow. It became background, constant, so thoroughly fused with his body and his mind that he could not imagine air without it. When he lay down at night, the smell clung to his skin, woven into the straw of his bedding. When he ate, he smelled it on his hands. Even in sleep, the stable lingered. Smell was not just the air around him. It was the medium in which he lived, shaping his existence as surely as the hierarchy of obedience and the rhythm of labor. To others, the stable might have seemed foul or oppressive, but to the boy it was simply home. Its odors grounded him, marked his life in ways words could not. Each smell told him something. Hay meant feeding, leather meant harnessing, manure meant cleaning, sweat meant work. They were signals as much as sensations, reminders of the endless cycle that bound him. The air itself was a teacher, shaping him silently, marking him as a stable boy in a way no written record ever could. And so, the smells of the stable became the unnoticed foundation of his world, ever present, ever constant, absorbed so fully into his existence that they were no longer things to be endured or avoided, but the very atmosphere of his life. The stable was most often a world of soft sounds, hooves shifting in straw, buckets sloshing, brushes dragging across coats, but every so often it yielded to a different rhythm, one that carried with it the weight of fire, metal, and sparks. On such days, the blacksmith arrived. His presence was not sudden. It came with the clank of iron tools set upon a cart, the creak of wheels drawn into the yard, and the steady tread of boots hardened by ash and heat. The boy knew the sound long before he saw the man, and his body, almost without thought, straightened from its rest to ready itself for the shift in air that the blacksmith's work always brought. The smith's world was the forge, but the stable was its extension, for the horse's hooves tied both spaces together. Iron was nothing without animals to wear it, and animals could not work without the shaping of iron. When a shoe loosened, when hoof split or cracked, when the Lord's destrier demanded readiness, the smith was called. He arrived with his tools, the hammer heavy with years of use, the rasp worn smooth at the handle, the pincers, the nails, and always the anvil, which was set upon a low stand like a silent witness to his craft. The boy watched as the smith laid his tools in careful order. Each one had its place, not by chance but by habit formed across decades of repetition. The smell of iron, sharp and metallic, clung to the man's clothes, mingling with the ash and soot of his forge. Even before the first strike of hammer, the stable seemed changed, its air thickened by the promise of heat and sound. When the fire was lit, the change deepened. The boy felt the air grow warmer as the small forge crackled to life, fed by charcoal and the smith's steady breath upon the bellows. Flames licked upward, sending smoke and sparks into the stable's dim air. The boy's eyes, accustomed to the muted colors of wood and straw, fixed upon the glow, a light both alive and dangerous. Unlike the soft glow of sun through thatch, the horses too felt it. Their ears flicked back, their nostrils flared at the unfamiliar smoke, and they shifted restlessly in their stalls. The boy's task became one of stillness and watchfulness, moving softly to calm them with quiet gestures, his small hand brushing a flank or muzzle, while the larger drama unfolded nearby. The sound came next, the sharp ring of hammer upon iron, It was a noise unlike any other in the stable, clear, metallic, echoing against the beams and startling in its brightness. Each strike carried finality, the iron reshaped one blow at a time. Sparks flew in brief arcs, small stars that burned and vanished before they touched the ground. To the boy, they seemed alive, carrying with them a fleeting danger, though the smith worked as if oblivious, his hand steady, his arm rising and falling with the rhythm of habit. Shoeing itself was a ritual of patience. The horse had to be calmed, its leg lifted and held steady, the hoof cleaned and paired, the shoe shaped and fitted. The boy observed closely, though he remained at the edge, too small to take part in the dangerous closeness of iron and hoof. He watched as the smith worked the hoof knife, shaving away the horn with careful pressure, the smell sharp and acrid as flakes of hoof fell to the floor. Then came the rasp, its rough edge scraping back and forth, evening the surface until it met the smith's unseen standard. When the shoe, glowing faintly from its shaping, was pressed to the hoof, a hiss filled the stable, sharp and sudden. The smell was unforgettable, a mingling of burnt horn, smoke and iron. The boy wrinkled his nose at first, but in time he grew used to it, learning to recognize it as part of the process, a necessary discomfort in the binding of animal to metal. The horse shifted, muscles quivering, but the smith's grip was firm, his voice low, his presence steady. The boy admired this steadiness, the quiet command with which the smith worked, not loud, not hurried, but rooted in certainty. Nails came last, driven carefully through the hoof wall, bent and clinched with precision. Each strike of the hammer was deliberate, no more and no less than required. The boy felt a kind of awe in this precision. Here was labor like his own, yet different, visible, noisy, marked by heat and sparks. His own work was silent, repetitive, disappearing into the daily rhythm of feeding and cleaning. The smith's, though equally routine to him, appeared dramatic in the boy's eyes, a transformation of raw iron into something fitted, useful, essential. Yet when the shoeing was done, when the hoof was lowered and the horse tested its weight upon the new shoe, the drama faded back into silence. The smith wiped his brow, set his tools in order once more, and the fire dwindled to embers. The boy, returning from his watchfulness, moved quietly through the stable again, calming the horses, sweeping away flakes of hoof and stray nails. The air remained heavy with the smell of burnt horn and iron, but slowly, steadily, the stable reclaimed its quieter rhythm. The boy breathed it in, letting the noise and sparks settle into memory. To him the smith's visit was a glimpse into another kind of labor, one where fire and iron shaped the world, where noise and heat carried the day, but it was still bound to the same cycle as his own, the care of horses, the demands of the Lord, the endless repetition of tasks. The boy saw in the smith not a figure of power, but a mirror of service, another man bent to labor, marked by smell and sound as surely as he was by straw and manure. As the smith gathered his tools and prepared to leave, the boy watched him go, the cart creaking once more across the yard. The sparks had vanished, the fire had dimmed, but the impression lingered, the memory of heat against his skin, of ringing iron in his ears, of a craft that seemed both strange and familiar. Soon enough, the stable would fold back into its own silence, but for a brief time it had been reshaped by the slow, methodical presence of the blacksmith. For the stable boy, time was not counted in weeks or months, for such divisions belonged more to the steward's records or the priest's calendar than to the rhythm of his life. Instead, time unfolded through the seasons, each carrying with it a distinct texture, a scent, a sound, and above all, a burden of labor, altered but never lifted. The seasons marked change in the world around him, yet within that change, his duty remained a constant thread. Summer arrived with long light that stretched the days to their limit. The stable grew warm, the air thick with the sweetness of hay drying in the meadows. Dust rose easily with every movement, turning sunlight into golden shafts that danced with drifting motes. Horses sweated heavily in the heat, their coats damp and darkened, their flanks heaving with the effort of work. Flies gathered thickly, buzzing without rest, and the boy's hands grew accustomed to swatting them away or brushing them from the animal's eyes. Water had to be carried more often, buckets filled and refilled to quench thirst that seemed endless. The air within the stable held a sharpness of sweat, of dust, of heat pressing down upon wood and straw alike. The boy worked bare-armed, his tunic clinging to his back, his breath slowing in the heavy stillness of noon. Yet summer brought not only labor but harvest, the gathering of hay, cut from the fields and stored in great heaps within lofts and barns. He helped where he could, his small body lifting what it could bear, his arms scratched by stalks, his hair filled with chaff. Each forkful tossed into storage was a promise of winter's survival, and though he did not think of the future in such terms, he understood instinctively the importance of fullness. Stalls must be stocked, animals must be fed, the Lord's horses must not want. Autumn carried change more than any other season. The fields turned gold, then brown, and the air sharpened with a chill that grew day by day. Leaves fell in rustling showers, swept across the stable yard, gathering in corners where wind pressed them flat. Rain fell more often, filling the air with dampness that seeped into wood, into straw, into bones. Mud clung to hooves, thick and heavy, requiring endless cleaning as animals returned from fields slick and weary. The boy's hands, raw from water and earth, found no respite. He scraped, brushed, shoveled, laying fresh straw to combat the damp. The smell of rot rose from the soaked ground, mingling with the stable's odors, until it seemed no corner of the manor was free from it. With autumn came preparation. Harnesses were inspected, carts repaired, fodder stored against the coming frost. The boy observed these tasks as much as he took part in them, learning by repetition that each autumn was less an ending than a warning. Winter was near, and it would demand more of him than warmth alone could provide. Winter settled with a heaviness that pressed into every part of life. The stable roof sagged beneath snow, its beams creaking in the weight. Breath hung visibly in the air, from both boy and beast, clouds of pale mist rising with each exhalation. The boy's hands grew stiff with cold, fingers aching as he carried buckets of water that froze at their rims. Ice formed at the edges of troughs, needing to be broken before horses could drink. Straw, though plentiful, never seemed enough to stave off the chill, and so the boy laid it thick, spreading layers to keep the animals from sinking into frozen ground. The smell of the stable in winter deepened, less of dust, more of manure and damp, heavy in the closed air where doors were kept shut against the frost. The boy himself carried the chill in his very body. His breath froze on the ends of his hair, his skin cracked from dryness. Yet winter also carried a quietness unlike any other. Outside, the world was muted by snow, fields blanketed, paths obscured. Inside, the stable became a cocoon of warmth compared to the frozen air beyond. The boy lingered close to the animals, their bodies radiating heat, their breathing steady, comforting in the silence of frost. Spring did not arrive suddenly, but crept in, a slow loosening of the frost, a gradual softening of the ground. Snow melted into mud, and with it came new burdens. Hooves sank deep into sodden earth, demanding constant cleaning. The boy's feet squelched in muck that clung to boots and hems. The smell of rot returned, stronger now, as old straw, dung, and thawed earth combined into a pungent mixture that filled the air. Yet alongside it came freshness, the sharp green scent of new grass, the sweetness of blossoms carried faintly from orchards and hedgerows. The horses shed their winter coats, hair coming off in clumps that clung to the boy's hands, his tunic, the very air. He brushed them endlessly, pulling free the loose strands, watching as sleek coats slowly emerged beneath the roughness of winter growth. Work shifted to fields once more, plows drawn through softening soil, carts loaded with seed. The stable boy, though not in the fields himself, felt the shift in rhythm, animals leaving early, returning weary, their bodies carrying the scent of damp soil and new grass. Through all these seasons his work changed in detail, but not in essence. Summer brought sweat, winter brought frost, autumn brought mud, and spring brought shedding, but always the horses needed feeding, stalls needed cleaning, water needed carrying. The seasons altered the surface, not the core. His duty remained steady, a line of labor unbroken by the cycle of weather. The boy did not mark years, he marked tasks repeated across them. He knew summer by hay dust in his hair, autumn by mud on his boots, winter by frost in his breath, spring by hair clinging to his hands. Time passed, not as memory, but as rhythm, each season folding into the next, each year indistinguishable, except for the endless repetition of tasks. In this way, the seasons taught him patience, not the patience of waiting for change, but the patience of knowing that change itself only ever returned him to the same labor. And so, whether under blazing summer light, biting winter frost, damp autumn rain, or the slow thaw of spring, the boy's place remained unchanged. His body bent, his hands moved, his life circled endlessly through seasons that altered everything yet changed nothing. The stable boy's world was centered on the horses, and the straw beneath their hooves. Yet beyond the heavy doors of timber, and the low smell of hay there stretched the larger body of the manor, a village bound by obligation and silence. It was not a place of grandeur, though it was the heart of countless lives, each tethered to earth and duty. To step outside, even briefly, was to see that his work was one thread, woven into a fabric much wider and more enduring than his own. The village lay clustered around the manor hall, though not in neat order. Houses were scattered in irregular lines, their walls of wattle and daub leaning slightly with age, their thatched roofs patched with straw wherever last winter's storms had pulled them bare. Smoke drifted from low chimneys, never rising cleanly, but always clinging to the damp air, carrying with it the sharp smell of burning wood and the heavier scent of peat dug from marshes nearby. The air was rarely still, yet the village moved with such quiet constancy that sound seemed absorbed by the earth itself. At dawn, as the stable boy stirred to his own tasks, the village already carried its subdued rhythm. Men bent their backs in the fields, their figures small against the pale light, moving steadily with hoes and ploughs. Women knelt at streams, their hands red from cold water, beating linen against worn stones. Children too young for heavier labor wandered with baskets, gathering kindling or herbs, their small feet leaving patterns in the mud that soon washed away with rain. It was not silence in the pure sense, for there were always sounds. The groan of cartwheels over ruts, the lowing of cattle driven out to pasture, the faint bark of dogs, the irregular call of crows circling above the fields. Yet none of these sounds broke the stillness. Rather, they seemed part of it, repeating each day until they blended into an endless background. Life in the village was not hurried, not loud, but it was never free from motion, for idleness was a luxury few could afford. The boy, when he carried buckets of water from the well or fetched hay from a nearby loft, would sometimes catch sight of these labors, though rarely did he pause to watch. Each villager carried within them the same understanding: survival required work, and work demanded silence. Words were used sparingly, often only when necessary. The rhythm of life was communicated, not through chatter, but through gestures, through familiarity with the tasks repeated by each hand, through a knowledge passed quietly from one body to another. In the distance stood the fields, stretching beyond the manor's wooden palisade, where strips of land were divided and worked in common. Here the open field system dictated the shape of life itself, long narrow strips tilled side by side, each peasant holding scattered pieces rather than whole plots, a design that kept them bound together in interdependence. From the stable boy's vantage, the field seemed vast, rolling gently, marked not by walls but by furrows, their order maintained not by fences but by centuries of custom. Season by season, the villagers bent themselves to these strips. In autumn, they sowed grain. In winter they endured. In spring they weeded, and in summer they reaped. Each stage brought its own form of quietness. The quiet of planting when earth was pressed with hope, the quiet of harvest when scythes moved steadily and grain was bundled into sheaves. Noise was unnecessary. The earth answered only to persistence, not to voices. Around the village square, or what passed for one, stood a small church, its stone walls humble but enduring. The bell hung above, not large, but its sound carried clearly across the clustered houses. It was the one sound that broke through the silence with authority, calling villagers to mass on Sundays, to festivals, to moments when the rhythm of toil briefly shifted into ritual. The boy heard its tolling even from the stable, a sound that punctuated his days though he rarely stepped inside the building itself. The village also carried its odors, as strong and constant as its sounds. Dung lay piled nearby rivers, its stench mingling with the smoke of hearths. Fish caught from rivers dried in the sun, their sharp scent cutting through the air. Herbs grew in garden plots, rosemary, sage and garlic releasing faint fragrance when touched. To the stable boy, moving between these places, the smells were neither strange nor overwhelming. They were simply part of existence, as familiar as the texture of mud beneath his boots or the weight of buckets in his hands. Evenings, when labor lessened, the village did not erupt into noise but sank into a deeper quiet. Fires glowed within houses, light leaking through cracks in doors or thin windows of oiled parchment. Shadows moved inside, figures bent over bowls of pottage or loaves of coarse bread. Outside, dogs lay curled near doorways, their ears flicking at faint sounds, while cats prowled among refuse heaps. The air cooled, smoke thickened, and the day's end arrived without ceremony. To stable boy, moving between his last tasks of feeding and bedding, could feel this quiet settling not just upon the village, but upon himself. It was not peace in the sense of comfort, for hunger, cold and fatigue were never far, but it was a stillness born of repetition. Each villager, like himself, accepted that tomorrow would be the same: fields to till, animals to tend, water to carry, fire to stoke. This broader quiet of the village framed his own smaller silence. Within the stable, he was unseen, a shadow among shadows. Yet when he stepped beyond its threshold, he saw that his work was only one reflection of a larger truth. Life here was bound to earth, to weather, to duty, and to silence. The manor was not a place of voices rising, but of labor repeated until it seemed eternal. And so, as he returned to the dim light of the stable, the boy carried with him the weight of the village's quiet. It pressed into him as surely as the smell of straw, shaping him not only as a stable boy, but as one of many, a life stitched invisibly into the larger fabric of medieval rural existence. His silence was theirs, their silence was his. The life of the stable boy unfolded within a framework older than himself, older than his parents, older even than the timbered hall that dominated the manor grounds. It was the system of feudal obligation, a structure so entrenched in the medieval world that it seemed as natural as the cycle of the seasons. In such a system, every man, woman, and child bore weight in accordance with their station, and for those at the bottom, peasants, serfs, servants, the weight was heavy and constant. The stable boy occupied one of the lowest rungs, a figure whose existence was almost invisible to the lord whose horses he tended, and yet the labor of his hands ensured that others higher up the chain could live with ease. Horses were not luxuries, they were vital. They carried knights into war, bore lords to neighboring estates, hauled carts filled with grain, plowed furrows into fields. Without them, transport slowed, harvests faltered, messages lingered undelivered. And so, in the shadows of the stable, his unnoticed hands performed tasks that upheld the smooth running of lives he could never share. The hierarchy of the manor was visible everywhere, though rarely spoken aloud. At the top stood the lord, his authority absolute within his domain. His hall rose above the village, not always grand, yet unmistakably dominant, its size alone a symbol of wealth and command. Beneath him, stewards and reeves carried out the management of the estate, ensuring rents were paid, fields were worked, and obligations were fulfilled. Clergy tended to souls, scribes to records, blacksmiths to tools. Beneath these came the peasants, bound to the soil, their labor feeding all above them, and at the very base, like roots invisible beneath the earth, stood the servants, cooks, herdsmen, swineherds, and the stable boy. For the boy, this order was not questioned, for it was not presented as a matter of choice. From birth, he had been folded into it. Children of peasants grew into peasants. Children of servants grew into servants. The structure did not invite ambition, nor did it require explanation. It simply was. To resist it was unthinkable. To endure it was expected. The weight of servitude did not press suddenly upon his shoulders, but was instead a constant presence, like the air he breathed, or the dirt beneath his nails. His tasks, carrying water, laying straw, brushing coats, mucking stalls, were repetitive and unnoticed, yet they were also indispensable. Without his effort, horses grew restless, their strength diminished, their usefulness compromised. And without the horses, the lord's household would falter in ways too costly to accept. Thus, though his body was small and his station low, the boy's servitude carried the paradox of invisibility and necessity. He was forgotten in word, yet relied upon in deed. In the manor's hierarchy, silence was itself a form of servitude. The boy's voice mattered little. Orders flowed downward, not upward. He listened, obeyed, performed. To speak too freely risked rebuke, for authority belonged to others. His silence was not chosen but imposed, a reminder that his place was to work, not to question. Even in the stable, where horses were the only witnesses, the habit of silence remained, for it had been pressed into him from the earliest age. And yet, the weight of servitude was not only personal, but collective. Every villager bore their portion of labor to the manor lord. Some paid with grain, some with livestock, some with coin, when coin could be spared. Many paid with days of forced labor, week after week of tilling the lord's fields, mending his fences, cutting his wood. It was a web of obligations stretching outward, binding each life to the next, until the village itself was less a collection of families than a body of service, sustaining a single figure of authority. The stable boy, though young and overlooked, was a thread in this web. His servitude, though smaller in scope than the peasant's plough, or the reeve's accounts, held the same character. It was labor performed for the benefit of others. He did not choose whom to serve. He was born into it. The horses he cared for would never be his to ride. The carts they pulled would never carry his harvest. The power they sustained would never lift him. And yet his hands ensured their strength, their readiness, their obedience. This imbalance was not unique to him. It was the mark of the entire system. At the top, few bore little weight and enjoyed much. At the bottom, many bore much weight and enjoyed little. The boy's aching arms, the dirt beneath his nails, the blisters that hardened into calluses, all served to maintain a life more comfortable for those above him. His labor ensured smooth passage for the lord's journeys, swift delivery for the steward's messages, steady movement for the carts that carried the manor's goods. His servitude, though unnoticed, was constant service to lives distant from his own. To live in such a system was to live with acceptance, not because acceptance was freely given, but because alternatives scarcely existed. The boy did not imagine escape, for he did not know the world beyond the manor. Roads led outward, yes, but to places equally bound by lords, by service, by hierarchy. Even if he could walk beyond the boundaries of his world, the same structure awaited him elsewhere, stretching across the breadth of medieval Europe. Servitude was not merely the condition of his village, it was the condition of his age. The weight of servitude pressed not only upon his back, but upon his sense of self. To be born at the bottom was to carry the knowledge that one's life would likely remain at the bottom. He was not a figure who dreamed of change, for dreams were shaped by what one saw, and what he saw was endless labor, endless obedience, endless service. His world was shaped by repetition, not transformation. And so, with each day of feeding, cleaning, brushing, carrying, the boy absorbed the unspoken truth. His life was to sustain the lives of others. Yet there was a strange endurance in this weight. Though he carried servitude, he also carried necessity. His place, while low, was not purposeless. The boy's work mattered, though not in ways that earned recognition. It mattered in the quiet continuity of the manor, in the smooth rhythm of a system too vast for him to see in its entirety. His servitude ensured the survival of others, just as theirs ensured the survival of him. The burden was heavy, yet it was also shared, borne across countless shoulders, repeated across countless villages, forming the invisible foundation of medieval life. Thus, the weight of servitude, though unyielding, was not extraordinary to him. It was ordinary, expected, unquestioned. It shaped his days as surely as the turning of the seasons, as inevitably as the rising of the sun. And so, though he remained unnoticed, his life was part of the great machinery of service, one cog among many, moving endlessly, silently, without pause. By the time evening drew across the manor grounds, the stable had already grown heavy with the day's work. Dust lingered in the rafters, stirred by the constant motion of hooves and hands, and the smell of sweat, straw and manure clung thickly to the wooden walls. Outside, the last light stretched long across the fields, softening the edges of furrows and cottages alike, until every shape seemed blurred, as though the earth itself were settling into quiet. For the stable boy, evening brought not an end to labor, but a return to the beginning. Just as the morning had begun with feeding, so too did the day close with the same ritual, repeated in slower measure. He fetched the grain, scooped with care, the sound of kernels shifting in the bucket echoing softly in the near darkness. Each step back to the stalls felt deliberate, the rhythm no longer brisk but drawn out, as though his own body mirrored the fading of the sun. The horses waited in silence, though not without motion. They shifted their weight, tails flicking against their flanks, ears turning toward his approach. Their eyes caught the dim light, reflecting faintly, 2 points of brightness in shadowed heads. The boy moved among them steadily, his small figure weaving between larger bodies that loomed like statues, their warmth radiating into the cool of dusk. He poured grain into troughs, the dull scatter of seeds against wood, softened by the hush of evening. Water too had to be seen to. Buckets were carried, heavier now for his weariness, their slosh subdued as though even the liquid moved with evening's slower pulse. The troughs, worn smooth from years of use, caught the dim glow of twilight, their surfaces rippling faintly as horses lowered their muzzles. The boy paused sometimes, resting his hands on the bucket's rim, watching the way the animals drank, their gulps deep and rhythmic, their breath rising in soft clouds as the air cooled. Outside the stable, the world was quieting. Peasants made their way back from the fields, their figures bent, their footsteps dragging, their tools carried loosely in hands that had little strength left to grip. Smoke rose again from hearths, curling low as if reluctant to leave the earth. Dogs barked distantly, their sounds muffled by distance and the thickening air. The bell of the church, struck once more, marked the approach of night prayers, its sound low and resonant, rolling across the manor with a tone that seemed to sink rather than rise. Inside, the stable was filled, not with silence but with subdued sound. The crunch of horses chewing echoed steadily, joined by the rustle of straw under shifting hooves. Chains clinked faintly against posts. A mouse darted across the floor, unnoticed except for the faintest rustle of movement. All of these sounds carried a softness that the boy had grown accustomed to, each one blending into the next until they became less distinct than the steady presence of the stable itself. The boy's own movements were slower now. His arms ached from the day's tasks, his back stiff, his hands rough with splinters and calluses. Yet there was no rush. The pace of evening allowed for a kind of heaviness, the acceptance that this was the final labor before rest. He brushed against a horse's flank, the animal's warmth lingering on his sleeve, and bent to adjust the straw beneath its hooves. He pulled the pitchfork through the floor with measured strokes, not with the brisk rhythm of morning, but with a slower sweep, ensuring the bedding was spread evenly before night closed fully in. The smells, too, shifted with the hour. Morning carried freshness, the sharpness of cold air, the sweetness of hay newly disturbed. Evening held density. The air was warm with the breath of animals, pungent with manure, thick with the earthy dampness of straw that had borne the day's weight. Leather harnesses, hanging from pegs, released their faint odor of oil and sweat. The scent was neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It was simply the atmosphere in which he lived, the stable's enduring presence pressing into every sense. As darkness deepened, the boy lit a small lamp, its flame unsteady, casting long, uncertain shadows against beams and walls. Light pooled in narrow circles, revealing straw, buckets and the curve of hooves, while beyond, the corners remained lost in obscurity. The flicker of the lamp transformed the familiar space into something more uncertain, every movement exaggerated, every shadow deepened. Yet he did not fear it. He had grown within it, learned its forms, recognized its sounds. The stable at night was not strange but intimate, a place where silence was thick, yet never empty. Once the horses were fed, watered, and bedded, the boy paused, leaning against the doorframe, watching the animals settle into stillness. Their chewing slowed, their bodies shifted less often, and soon they stood quietly, heads lowered, eyes half closed. Their presence filled the space with a steady calm, as though they too acknowledged the weight of day and the promise of night's rest. The boy lingered, his body unwilling to move, though his tasks were done. Evening had a heaviness unlike morning. Where dawn was the beginning of toil, evening was its echo, repeating the same duties, but in a softened tone, a rhythm of conclusion rather than initiation. The boy did not reflect on it in words, for he had no language for such thoughts, but his body understood. Morning carried anticipation, evening carried relief. Both carried labor, but one led forward, the other drew downward into stillness. At last he set the lamp aside, closed the stable doors with a slow push, and stepped into the fading light outside. The air was cooler now, touched by the dampness of nightfall. Stars began to prick the sky faintly, though clouds lingered at the horizon. The village lay quiet, fires glowing within huts, faint voices drifting on the air but never rising loud enough to break the stillness. The manor hall loomed above, its windows faintly lit, yet distant from his world. The boy's day was done, though tomorrow would bring its mirror image again. Dawn, feeding, cleaning, labor unbroken. Yet for this moment, at the threshold between day and night, there was only the slow quiet of evening feeding. The mirrored rhythm of morning slowed to darkness, the stable itself closing into silence. Night crept gently across the manor, swallowing the last traces of twilight, until only the faint glow of hearth smoke and distant torches marked the human presence on the land. The manor house sat high upon its mound, a silhouette of stone against the dim sky, but here at the stable's edge, the world felt smaller, enclosed, almost sealed away from the larger emotions of lord and village. Inside, the stable rested in its own rhythm. The boy, having completed the evening's feeding, lingered near the doorway, uncertain whether to leave or to stay. His body, worn by labor, longed for rest, but another pull kept him there, the quiet presence of the horses. They were no longer restless, no longer stamping or calling. Instead, they had folded into the night's hush, their bodies standing heavy and still, their breath slow and deep. The air was cooler now, carrying with it a faint dampness that clung to the wood and straw. The smell of the day still lingered. Sweat, hay, manure, but softened under the cover of dark, as though night itself dulled sharp edges and left only muted tones. The boy's lamp burned low, its light trembling in a shallow circle, revealing a portion of the stable, yet leaving most of it hidden in shadow. Beyond that fragile glow, eyes gleamed faintly, horses half watching, half dreaming. The silence was not empty. It was filled with sound so subtle, it became almost indistinguishable from stillness. The steady exhale of horses carried in low gusts, rising and falling like the breath of the earth itself. Occasionally, one shifted, hooves thudding softly against wood, straw crunching beneath weight. A tail flicked, brushing against the stall wall. Leather harnesses hanging from their pegs gave the occasional creak as the wood contracted in the coolness. These were not disruptions, they were the silent's own heartbeat, the signs of life within stillness. The boy sat down on a block of wood near the central aisle, his body folded, arms resting across his knees. From this place he watched, but more than watching, he listened. In the deep calm he felt himself shrink, not in fear, but in humility. The horses were immense in the shadows, their breath steady, their forms like quiet sentinels. He was small among them, yet not unwelcome. In their silence there was room for him, as though his presence was simply absorbed into the broader rhythm. One horse shifted closer, pressing its muzzle against the edge of the stall. The boy reached out, his fingers brushing the soft curve of its nose. Warmth met his skin, a steady exhale misting lightly against his hand. He did not speak, he did not need to. Words would have disturbed the night's weight. Instead, the contact lingered, a silent recognition between servant and beast, between small boy and great animal, both bound to the same cycle of duty and rest. Outside, the world was nearly still. The distant voices of the village had quieted, doors barred, hearths smouldering low. Only the occasional bark of a dog or the faint call of a night bird broke the hush, and even those seemed softened by distance. The manor bell was silent, its day's work done. Stars crept steadily into the sky, faint but patient, scattering across the blackness like seeds. The moon, veiled by clouds, lent only a pale wash of light, leaving the stable's lamplight the only fragile brightness in his world. Within, the boy let himself drift into the rhythm of breathing around him. Each horse drew air in, let it out, a slow rise and fall that overlapped, merged, created a kind of low music. It was not a song but a presence, an invisible tide that rolled through the stable. To listen was to feel it pressing softly into him, reminding him that life, even when silent, was always moving, always enduring. His thoughts wandered, not in words but in sensations. He felt the ache of his hands, the weight in his legs, the warmth of the lamp against his cheek. He thought of nothing he could name, but he felt himself dissolving into the stable's stillness, as if the boundaries between boy, horse, wood, and straw blurred. The stable was no longer a place he worked within, but a living space he belonged to, a rhythm he moved in, even when motion ceased. The horses too seemed caught between waking and sleep, their eyes half closed, their ears flicking only faintly. They stood heavy but peaceful. In the darkness, their size was magnified, their bodies loomed, but without threat. They were guardians of the silence, holding it in their massive frames, breathing it out in slow, steady measure. The boy thought of morning, though it was far away. He knew he would rise before the sun again, repeat the cycle, feed, water, clean, labor. But that thought did not press against him with weight tonight. It floated distantly, a shape beyond the dark horizon. Tonight there was only this, the quiet of horses at rest, the silence filled not with emptiness, but with presence. The boy's body stilled into the rhythm of animals larger than himself. He leaned his head back against the beam behind him, eyes half closed, listening still. The lamp's flame flickered lower, threatening to extinguish, but he did not move to tend it. If it went out, the night would hold him anyway, the horse's quiet breath enough to guide his sense of place. The silence grew deeper, not because sound lessened, but because he became part of it. The boy was no longer simply hearing it, he was within it, a thread in its tapestry. The weight of servitude, the ache of labor, the long day's toil, all were softened, absorbed into this shared calm. Night did not erase them, but it held them gently, as the stable held him, and so he remained, not asleep, but not fully awake, resting in the company of silent giants. The stable at night was not a place of work or command, but of stillness, where even the smallest boy and the greatest horse breathed the same quiet air, side by side, bound by the silence of the medieval night. Time in a medieval manner did not rush forward in leaps or strides. It unfolded quietly, slowly, almost unnoticed, its passage marked not by sudden events, but by the repeating cycles of tasks and seasons. For the stable boy, whose world was bounded by the wooden beams of the stable and the fields surrounding the manor, years did not arrive as grand announcements. They crept in with the thaw of frost, the scent of spring earth, the haze of summer dust, and the bite of autumn winds. They slipped past in the way straw was scattered and swept again, in the way horses aged and were replaced, in the way his own limbs grew stronger, then tired, without his fully realizing the change. At first he was small, barely strong enough to lift a full bucket of water, or guide the heavier bales of hay. He stumbled in his early tasks, fumbling with the pitchfork, straining to keep pace with the rhythm set by older hands. His arms ached, his back bent too quickly, and every evening left him with blisters raw from ropes and wood. Yet with time his body thickened, his shoulders broadened, and what once seemed impossible became simply expected. The tools did not grow lighter, but his muscles learned their weight. The ache became a constant companion, no longer sharp but familiar, an unnoticed part of his existence. The horses marked the years in their own way. Colts grew into strong animals fit for pulling carts or bearing riders. Some horses left, taken for war, or sold at market, and new ones arrived to fill the stalls. He remembered each by their habits, the one who stamped impatiently at feeding time, the one who leaned heavily against the stall door, the one whose coat gleamed even in low light. Horses lived long lives compared to dogs or chickens, but still their cycle was shorter than that of men. To the boy, watching them grow old and be replaced became another rhythm of passing years. The stable never stood empty, yet it never contained the same animals for long. The seasons, too, were relentless in their repetition. Winters pressed harshly against the stable walls, bringing frost that crusted the water buckets and breath that hung in the air like smoke. The boy learned to rise in darkness, his fingers stiff and numb as he shoveled frozen straw, his feet aching from the chill of damp earth. Then spring would return, softening the ground, filling the stable with the scent of wet hay and thawed earth. Mud caked his boots, and streams of water trickled from the roof beams, dripping into troughs with steady rhythm. Summer came heavy with heat, flies buzzing around the horses' flanks, the air thick with dust and sweat, and autumn, always slower, always quieter, spread its damp chill through the wood, filling the stable with the smell of rotting leaves carried on the wind. Each year repeated these turns without fail. Each year folded neatly into the one before, so that to the boy, time seemed both endless and circular. Days differed in small ways. One horse sickened, another colt born, but in the broader view, they were the same. Work began before the sun rose, carried on through its climb, and did not end until long after it fell. The rhythm of feeding, watering, and cleaning was unbroken, so steady that it blurred the line between one year and the next. He noticed changes only when they had already passed. One day he found his hands no longer blistered by ropes, the skin thick and calloused instead. Another day he realized he could lift the heavy bales without staggering. Years later, he found himself breathing heavier after the same tasks, the ache returning, though in a deeper, slower way. Time revealed itself not in sudden moments, but in these quiet shifts where effort became strength, and strength slowly bent again into fatigue. The manor around him changed little. The lord grew older, perhaps, his hair turning grey, his gait slower, but his authority remained untouched, his needs unchanged. New children were born in the manor house, new voices filled the halls, and the old ones vanished without notice, replaced by others. In the village, generations turned as well, yet always peasants tilled the same fields, spun the same wool, carried out the same duties. The boy who had once been nameless among them remained nameless still, even as his body grew into a man's. Servitude did not lessen with age. It did not grant recognition. It was a mantle that fit as tightly in adulthood as in youth, pressing down without regard for time. The horses, though, gave shape to his memory. He remembered their coats, their tempers, their strength, more clearly than he remembered the faces of lords or even fellow servants. They passed through his hands like beads on a string, each unique, yet all part of the same unbroken line. In their eyes, he sometimes glimpsed himself reflected, small, tired, bent, but always present. They did not see years as humans did. They lived in the present, in the feel of feed in the trough, in the comfort of water drawn fresh, in the scratch of brush against their coats. The boy, aging slowly, found himself drawn into that same existence. When he was young, he thought of what might lie beyond the stable, the manor, the endless repetition. But as years pressed on, those thoughts faded, worn away by the constant demands of daily duty. Time did not allow for dreams that stretched too far. It permitted only the quiet endurance of the cycle, the acceptance of each season's return, each horse's arrival and departure. He found a strange comfort in it, an assurance that no matter how years passed, the tasks would remain. The passing of years did not bring recognition. No chronicle recorded the growing man who had once been the small boy in the straw. No lord spoke his name with memory. Yet, in the silence of the stable, his presence lingered year after year, his labour woven into the wooden beams, the worn tools, the very smell of the place. Time erased him from the larger world, but within the stable, the rhythm of his years remained etched, invisible but indelible. And so, The boy became a man, and the man aged quietly, not marked by great events or celebrated deeds, but by the endless cycle of duty. Time did not rush forward here. It circled, like the seasons, like the labor, like the years themselves. And as each circle closed, the stable boy moved with it, bound by the rhythm, unnoticed but enduring, as horses came and went, and the manor remained. The world of the stable was narrow. Its walls defined his horizon, its smells and sounds the constant landscape of his days. Yet, every so often the wider currents of the manor world reached him. They did not arrive in the form of speeches or commands, for such things belong to the halls of lords. Instead, they arrived as ripples, the sudden arrival of men in armor, the clang of iron on iron, the heavy tread of war horses that stood taller and prouder than the plough beasts he tended. These were not everyday visitors, but when they came, they reshaped the stable's rhythm for a time, reminding him of the vast divide between those who labored quietly and those who carried banners into the world. The boy, who was now more man than child, recognized the signs of their coming before they appeared. First came the voices, deep and commanding, echoing from the manor yard. Then came the ringing of metal, the scrape of chainmail being hauled from storage, the muted thunder of hooves as horses were led from pasture into the stable. The stable, usually a place of quiet breath and soft rustlings, swelled suddenly with urgency. Grooms and helpers hurried, lords and their squires entered with expectation, and the boy found himself pushed to the edges of a scene larger than himself. The knight's horses were unlike the others. They were taller, broader at the chest, their coats gleaming with a different sheen. Some had been bred for speed, their muscles taut beneath skin. Others carried the massive weight of destriers, trained to bear armored men into battle. The boy had tended them in ordinary times, feeding, watering, brushing their coats. But when the knights arrived, the horses seemed to change. They became part of something more, their bodies fitted with gear heavier and more intricate than the simple harnesses of carts. He watched as armor was strapped into place, chamfrons to shield their faces, croppers to protect their hindquarters, caparisons of cloth and heraldic colors draped across their backs. The ordinary animals of morning feedings became armored beasts, transformed in the space of an hour into symbols of lordship and war. The boy's role was simple. He brushed coats, fetched water, lifted saddles under direction. His hands performed the small, unnoticed labors that allowed the knights to prepare. He stood aside as squires adjusted straps, as lords tested the weight of their shields, as horses stamped and snorted under new burdens. His presence was necessary, yet invisible. He was not part of the pageantry. He was the shadow that moved between the shining figures, the hand that steadied a horse while a knight mounted, the one who swept the straw trampled by iron-shod hooves. He felt the heat of the forge when the blacksmith prepared final fittings, sparks casting brief light against the stable's gloom. He smelled the mingling scents of leather, sweat and oiled steel, sharper and heavier than the usual odors of hay and manure. He heard the clatter of chainmail and the low murmur of lords speaking of campaigns, of borders, of enemies whose names he barely understood. The words drifted past him without weight. They were not his to carry. There was awe in these moments, though muted by distance. The boy could not help but see the knights as figures apart, armored men whose names were remembered, whose deeds would be told in halls and written in chronicles. They were not bent by servitude in the way he was. Their labor was violent, visible, and honored. His was repetitive, hidden, and forgotten. The divide stretched wide between them, though they stood only feet apart within the same stable walls. Sometimes he caught a knight's glance, a curt nod perhaps, or a brief word of instruction, but never recognition. To the knight, he was a hand, a tool, a servant, as interchangeable as the straw beneath their feet. He did not resent it. He did not expect more. Yet in those moments, standing in the dim stable, watching armor gleam and banners flutter, he was reminded of his place at the farthest margin of the manor's hierarchy. The departure was always the same. Horses, armored and restless, stamped against the earth, their nostrils flaring. Men mounted with effort, their bodies heavy in mail and plate. The stable filled with the deep sound of hooves, striking the ground in unison, iron against earth, until the company turned toward the manor gate. Dust rose, banners lifted, and voices called out commands. In moments, the thunder receded, leaving only the fading echo of hoofbeats on the distant road. Silence returned, but it was a different silence than before. The stable seemed emptier, its air still trembling faintly with what had passed through. The boy swept, gathered discarded straw, stacked unused harnesses back in place. He restored the order that nights had disrupted, returning the stable to its ordinary rhythm. Yet the echo lingered, faint but insistent, the glimpse of knighthood, the reminder of another world that brushed briefly against his own before vanishing again. Years passed, and the pattern repeated. Knights came and went, sometimes in armor, sometimes only in hunting dress, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with urgency. The boy, now older, remained at the edge, his role unchanged. He grew used to their presence, less startled by the clang of chainmail, less struck by the gleam of heraldry. But he never became part of it. He remained always just outside, his hands essential, his name unknown. In time, the faces of knights blurred in his memory, one after another, blending into the same figure, a mounted man with shining gear, speaking words of command, riding out into a world beyond the manor. He did not remember their names, nor the causes of their journeys, but he remembered the horses, the destriers with their thick necks, the coursers with their lean strength, the palfreys with their smoother gaits. He remembered their breath against his hands, their weight as he tightened girths, their restless hooves stamping straw into dust. The knights came and went, but the horses lingered longer in his memory, as though their presence was more real than the men they bore. And always, he returned to the rhythm of his own tasks. Knights might ride into glory, or into death, their names carried in stories he would never hear. But he remained in the stable, brushing coats, carrying water, scattering hay. His world did not widen with theirs, it remained fixed, repetitive, circular. He caught only glimpses of knighthood, echoes passing briefly through the stable, leaving him unchanged but not unmoved. The glimpse itself became part of his rhythm, not hope, not envy, simply acknowledgement. A reminder that beyond the quiet of horses and straw, another world existed, a world he touched only at its edges, before retreating again into the silence of his endless work. The body does not keep silent forever. It records each day, each task, in marks and aches that cannot be undone. For the stable boy, grown now into a man, and edging slowly into middle years, the weight of time showed itself not in sudden breaks or sickness, but in the quiet persistence of wear. It gathered invisibly, like dust on beams, settling into muscles, joints, and skin, until it could no longer be brushed away. At first, when he was young, he rose from the straw each morning with little thought of pain. Fatigue passed quickly, blisters hardened into calluses, and stiffness in his back loosened with the first hours of work. The body recovered, because it was still pliant, still fresh, but as the years layered one upon the other, the recovery slowed. Aches lingered through the night, and by dawn they had not vanished but only dulled. Tasks that once felt ordinary carried a deeper weight. The buckets were no heavier, the pitchfork no larger, but his arms felt them differently. His hands, thick-skinned and scarred from rope and splinter, carried reminders of every repetition. The joints spoke first. Knees creaked when he rose from crouching, a grinding sound muffled beneath flesh. His shoulders stiffened in the cold, refusing smooth motion, until many minutes of work had loosened them. Fingers, once quick and strong, sometimes locked briefly, reluctant to curl fully around brush or handle. These were not afflictions severe enough to stop him. They were simply the quiet toll of endless labor, unnoticed by others, but constant to him. The skin of his palms bore the clearest testimony. Where once it had blistered and bled, it had grown hard and thick. Calluses layered over one another, until the ridges of his hands felt like rough bark. They cracked in winter when the air was dry, split open in thin lines that stung when touched by sweat or water. Yet they healed without softness, sealing again into coarse patches. The hands of a servant told his story more honestly than any chronicle could. No ink would write his life, but his skin recorded every hour, every grip of rope, every pull of water from the well. His back, too, had begun to bow. Not dramatically, not in a way visible to lords or knights who passed briefly through the stable, but in the quiet, when he straightened after sweeping, he felt the curve, an arc that had deepened imperceptibly with each season of bending and lifting. He did not notice when it began. It had simply crept into him, as steady as the turning of seasons, until he could no longer remember standing fully upright without effort. Still, he worked. The manor did not pause, because his body carried weight differently. Horses still needed feeding, stalls still demanded cleaning, tools still required lifting. Labor did not bend to the servant's strength, the servant bent to labor, and so he carried on, even as each day pressed more heavily than the last. Weariness seeped not only into bone and muscle but into breath. The climb from well to stable, once quick, now left him pausing briefly, his lungs working harder to draw in air. Heat in summer pressed more deeply against his chest, and cold in winter tightened the air in his throat. He did not collapse. He did not falter in dramatic ways. He simply carried the breath with more effort, as though each inhalation was a stone lifted, each exhalation a stone set down. The world around him noticed little. Lords expected the same labor, horses required the same care, seasons turned with the same indifference. Other servants grew old too, though many were replaced, lost to sickness, accident, or the simple demands of death. New faces filled familiar roles, but the rhythm of work remained unbroken. In that rhythm, his weariness was invisible. No one marked the way he rose more slowly, the way he rubbed his knees before lifting, the way he paused longer before carrying a full load. The erosion of his body belonged only to him, noticed only in the solitude of night, when he lay on straw and felt the throb of joints, the ache of muscles that did not ease. And yet in this slow erosion, there was also endurance. His body weakened, but it did not break. It bent, but it did not cease. The years had marked him, but they had also shaped him to endure them. Pain became not an interruption, but a constant companion, folded into the rhythm of existence. He no longer thought of life as free of ache. He thought only of whether the ache grew sharper or softer from one day to the next. The stable itself seemed to mirror him. Its beams, once new, were darkened with years of smoke and weather. The wood creaked more loudly in the wind, its grain worn smooth by countless touches of hand and hoof. Nails rusted, doors sagged slightly on their hinges, the floorboards bowed under constant weight. Yet it still stood, still carried out its purpose, still held within it the same rhythm of work. Like him, it endured not by remaining unchanged, but by bearing the marks of time and continuing nonetheless. The horses changed more quickly. He had seen many grow old and weak, their coats dulling, their steps slowing, until they were no longer fit for plough or saddle. They were led away, replaced by others, their absence noted briefly before the rhythm resumed. Watching them, he understood his own place. He was no different, useful, while strong, unseen once wear made him falter. The manor's cycle would continue with or without him, absorbing his presence and forgetting it once it ended. Yet he did not rage against it. His life had never promised glory. It had promised only labor, and labor he gave, as fully as his body allowed. The weariness of bones was not betrayal but the natural end of years spent in service. It was the measure of his endurance, the quiet testimony that he had lived each day according to the rhythm given to him. In the silence of night, when horses slept and torches burned low, he felt the weight of his body most keenly. He stretched his hands stiff and cracked and listened to the creak of his joints. He lay down on straw and felt the pull of his back against the earth, and in that stillness, he accepted it. He was not young, he was not strong as he once had been, but he was still here, still part of the stable's breath, still moving within the endless circle of seasons. The weariness of bones was not the end. It was simply the next turn in the cycle, another layer of the rhythm that bound him to horses, to stable, to manor, to the passage of unnoticed years. Evening always came gently, almost unnoticed at first. The shadows stretched longer across the fields, the warm tones of the day turned into a softened glow, and the air shifted less sharp than morning, less heavy than noon, touched now with the coolness that announced the coming night. For the stable boy, dusk was not simply the turning of light, but the signal that one last round of duties must be completed before he could finally rest. The stable itself changed with the hour. In daylight, it was filled with motion, horses shifting in their stalls, the scrape of pitchforks, the splash of water into troughs, the tramp of boots across straw. But as the sun sank, a quietness gathered. The beams, once catching every ray of gold, fell into shadow. The smell of hay grew richer in the cool air, and the dust that floated all day long began to settle in the dimness, where morning had felt like the opening of a page. Dusk felt like the closing of one work folded back into stillness. The boy, now grown into a man worn by years of this rhythm, knew every step by heart. He moved without hurry, but also without pause. First, the grain. He measured it carefully, though by now he could do so with only the weight in his hand, knowing exactly how much each horse required. The sound of grain against wood, a soft rushing cascade, was the first sign to the horses that their evening meal had come. Heads lifted, ears flicked forward, and the low thud of hooves against stall walls echoed faintly as they stirred in anticipation. He carried the hay next, heavy bundles that brushed against his arms and left flecks of straw clinging to his shirt. He laid it out in even piles, each horse lowering its head to feed with the steady rhythm of chewing. The sound filled the stable, a chorus of contented grinding, punctuated by the occasional snort or stamp. It was a sound he knew as well as his own breath, a sound that meant order was restored, bellies filled, calm returning after the day's labors. The water came last, and it was always the hardest part. Buckets drawn from the well, cold and heavy, sloshing against his legs as he walked them carefully across the dirt floor. The horses drank greedily, their lips splashing against the surface, the water darkening the wood around the troughs. This task never grew lighter, though his arms had long ago adapted to the strain. Even in his weariness, he knew it must be done. Thirst could not wait for morning. When the feeding was finished, he turned to the stalls. He did not clean them fully at night. That was morning's burden, but he made sure they were comfortable. He spread straw where it had thinned, pulled it smooth with his fork, ensuring each horse would rest on a bed thick enough to carry them through until dawn. Horses shifted as he worked, their warmth pressing into the narrow aisles, their breaths misting faintly in the cooling air. He moved among them like a shadow, part of the stable's silence, his presence more felt than heard. Outside, the manor slowed. The clang of the smithy had long gone quiet. The fields were empty now, tools stacked, carts wheeled back into sheds. Smoke rose from chimneys, the faint scent of cooking fires drifting on the evening breeze. Voices carried softly from the village, the murmur of families gathering, the occasional laugh, a song half heard. But within the stable, there was only the rhythm of horses and the creak of wood as the structure settled into night. Sometimes, as he leaned against a post to rest, the boy-man looked toward the stable doors and caught sight of the last light over the manor grounds. The sky often blazed for a moment, before surrendering to dark. Streaks of red and orange, sometimes deep purple, spread across the horizon. It was a beauty he seldom had time to linger over, for tasks always called him back, but even a fleeting glimpse was enough. It reminded him that there was more to the world than labor, even if labor was all he knew. His own body slowed with dusk as well. Where in morning there had been urgency, in evening there was heaviness. His steps dragged slightly more, his shoulders sagged, his joints spoke louder, but there was also relief. Each motion brought him closer to stillness. Each completed task another weight lifted from his back. Evening was wearisome, but it was also forgiving. It carried the promise of rest, however brief, before dawn demanded the cycle begin anew. When at last the horses were fed, watered and settled, he made his final round. He checked each stall, ran a hand along a flank here, adjusted a rope there, whispered to one of the more restless animals. He knew them not as possessions, as the lord of the manor did, but as companions bound to his own life. Their sounds, their habits, their moods, all were as familiar as the tools he held daily. They too seemed to quiet in his presence, accepting his hand as part of their world. Finally, he closed the stable doors. The heavy wood shut with a low groan, sealing the dim space from the deepening night outside. Inside, the darkness grew thick, broken only by the faint glow of the small lantern he carried. He placed it carefully on a hook, its light casting long shadows that danced across beams and straw. The stable, alive all day with noise and movement, now seemed to breathe slowly, as if settling into slumber alongside its keeper. He lingered for a moment in the doorway, listening. The rhythmic breath of horses, the occasional snort, the rustle of hooves in straw, all blended into a soft music. To others, it might have seemed ordinary, nothing remarkable, but to him, it was a song he had lived his entire life to. It was reassurance that the day was finished, that life continued, that in his quiet, unseen way, he had once again kept the stable, and by extension, the manor itself in motion. Then he turned away. The night air outside was cooler now, carrying with it the scents of earth and smoke. The stars pricked the sky, clear and sharp above the dark fields. The manor lay hushed, its lights dimmed, its people behind closed doors. His day was done. Tomorrow would come again, with the same motions, the same labor, the same cycle repeating without end. But for now, there was only dusk, the close of the stable, and the fleeting comfort of stillness before sleep. The stable at dusk was always the same, and in its sameness, it carried the weight of his life, a cycle unbroken, unnoticed, yet endlessly endured. The end of a life such as his rarely came with fanfare, nor with mourning, but stretched beyond the small circle of those who lived in the manor's orbit. No chronicler set down his deeds in ink, no carved stone bore his likeness, no prayer was spoken for him beyond the rote mutterings of the parish priest. He lived as he worked, in quietness, in repetition, in obscurity, and when he was gone, the world did not halt to mark his passing. The fields were still tilled, the manor still ran, the horses still needed tending, and another pair of hands, younger, steadier, filled the role he once did. The medieval world was built on lives like his, not the lords whose names appear in records, nor the knights whose armor gleamed in sunlight, but the countless unnamed who bent their backs to labor, who maintained the rhythm of the manor, who endured the sameness of days until their bodies could endure no more. The stable boy, grown into a man whose hands carried the memory of tools, whose bones bore the weight of years, was only one among millions. Yet it was upon such lives that the entire structure of feudal society rested. His life was cyclical, and his death was absorbed into that cycle. Perhaps he was buried in the churchyard beyond the village, beneath a wooden cross that decayed within a generation. Perhaps his grave was unmarked, his body returned to earth in silence, his name spoken for the last time by the handful of kin who stood beside the shallow soil. Even then, their words were brief, their grief soon quieted by necessity, for work could not pause in his absence. The horses still stamped and snorted, the stalls still filled with straw that needed replacing. History does not preserve such lives. The chroniclers of abbeys and courts wrote of kings, of battles, of famines and plagues, of treaties signed and broken. They seldom recorded the boy who rose before dawn to feed the horses, who slept against beams in the stable's shadow, who knew the sound of hooves better than his own voice. His labor was folded into the background of history, invisible yet essential, the mortar between the stones of grander events. The stable itself outlived him. Wood was replaced, beams repaired, straw endlessly replenished. Horses came and went, each generation serving the needs of lords and laborers alike. Knights mounted steeds that once passed through his hands, though no one thought to recall the boy who brushed their coats or carried their feed. The rhythm he kept continued without him, carried by others whose names also slipped away into the silence of time. There is something humbling in this erasure. It is easy to think that a life forgotten is a life without meaning, yet meaning does not lie only in remembrance. The The boy's existence shaped the days of others in ways unseen, a horse fit for work because of his care, a knight carried safely into battle because of his grooming, a harvest hauled in carts drawn by animals he had fed. Each act was small, each day repetitive, yet together they formed the quiet machinery of the medieval world. Without him, without those like him, the manor would not have functioned, and the history of lords and kings would have unfolded differently. Still, he is absent from records, absent from memory, absent from the stories told in courts or written in scriptoria. What remains is only the trace of his labor, not the shape of his life. He becomes, like so many, an anonymous figure folded into the concept of the peasantry, a faceless worker in a field of countless others. Yet behind that anonymity was a boy who once breathed in the smell of hay at dawn, who once felt the warmth of a horse's muzzle against his palm, who once sat in the hush of night listening to the rhythm of animals sleeping. The medieval world produced countless such forgotten lives, the thatcher who repaired roofs in silence, the dairymaid who milked cows before sunrise, the ploughman who carved furrows through the soil, all lived and died without trace. They were not remembered individually, yet collectively they were the foundation upon which the visible world was built. The stable boy belongs to them, a thread in the fabric, unseen when one steps back to view the whole, yet essential to the weaving. Time moved on. The manor itself may have crumbled, overtaken by later centuries, its wood rotted, its stone dismantled, or built into other structures. The village changed shape, fields were enclosed or abandoned, wars and plagues swept through, and the very order of society transformed. Yet his labor remained embedded in that continuum. The horses he cared for carried grain that fed others, or bore men who fought battles that altered kingdoms. His hands, unnoticed, helped sustain the very events that history recorded, though his name did not travel alongside them. The forgotten life is not meaningless. It is a reminder that history is vast, and that the majority who lived it did so without recognition, without record, without legacy in the sense of names and monuments. Their legacy was instead woven into the persistence of daily life, the survival of families, the endurance of seasons, the unbroken rhythm of cycles that turned silently beneath the louder stories of kings and knights. And so, the stable boy's life ends as it began, in quietness. He is not remembered, but he is not entirely lost. For in imagining him, in reconstructing the rhythm of his days, the smell of the stable, the sound of horses in the night, we restore, however faintly, a presence that history itself did not keep. His story dissolves into the greater silence of time, yet within that silence, he still lingers, not as a name but as a shadow of labor, a fragment of the medieval world's unseen foundation. When the stable doors closed for the last time in his care, when his hands no longer lifted hay or carried water, the cycle did not end. Others carried it forward, others took his place, others lived the same forgotten pattern. His life, unmarked, became part of something larger than memory, the unending flow of history, where countless lives pass unseen, but never without meaning. And so we leave him there, within the dim stable at dusk, among the steady breath of horses, with the dust of straw settling in beams of fading light. A life small, a life unseen, yet a life complete, folded into the silence of the past.